Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC week number 3 overview and analysis video. In LEC versus in the winter split number 1, however you want to classify what we are at right now as we enter the second month of the year. It's time for week number 3, the final gigantic week of the regular season, 18 best of ones as per usual, but again, the final week where it's all 3 days of best of ones. I'm excited to get into everything. Obviously, we're going to have a pretty good idea of where everybody is landing in the standings. After this, we'll have a couple of our teams qualifying for playoffs officially for the first time this year, so very excited to get into everything. If you guys are excited as well, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect from this week, and did everything live up to your expectations? The LEC has been an absolute mess in terms of upsets since the beginning of the year, but honestly, if you were expecting anything else, then you've never watched the LEC before. This is the region where the bottom teams beat the top teams, and there's no middle tier because all of them are just constantly beating each other. It's just the way that things go in the LEC every single year, so curious to know where you guys are landing, both going into this week and kind of coming out of this week, and how those have differed. But without further ado, let's jump into things. Again, quick announcement as per usual at the start of this video. As this video is going up, I'm actually casting tonight for LPL English. You can find the links to that down in the description below. You'll find the YouTube and the Twitch. You can follow or subscribe depending on whichever platform you prefer. It's a big series that I am casting tonight. Thunder Talk taking on Ninjas in Pajamas for what is essentially the final thing to play for across the regular season in the LPL, a top 2 spot in Group Perseverance. If you're interested in that, check out the links in the description. But without further ado, with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into today's video. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the video, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we will be talking about the teams that are qualifying for the playoffs, you know, like I said, updating my power rankings, all of that stuff at the end, but most of today will be spent talking about the games we got over the course of week 3, so let's get into day number 1. Again, 18 best of ones means a long video and a lot to cover. So starting with day 1, we started off with the matchup kind of near the bottom of the standings here between Team Heretics and SK Gaming, where SK is going to pick up a pretty big win for themselves. I think these are clearly the 2 worst LEC teams left. You know, you can talk about KC Blue, probably, you know, pretty clearly being the worst team right now. Los Ratones is starting to find their form after a pretty terrible start, but in terms of the actual LEC partner teams that will be in the league for the rest of the year, Heretics and SK are pretty clearly the 2 weakest, I would say, in terms of their production over the beginning part of the year, and SK being able to kind of come out and win a game against a Heretics team that I think really wanted to show they could not be 10th in terms of these rankings. It's good for SK, it's bad for Heretics, and I think it's pretty clear to point out what the problem is right now for Heretics, and, you know, we're going to talk about this decently consistently throughout this video, but I tweeted this out as I was watching these games even just a couple of days ago. I have never seen a region more consistently not understand what the meta is than the LEC. They do this every year. In fact, it was kind of their big thing last year, and why they weren't particularly competitive at First Stand and MSI, and why they were struggling so much is it just does not feel like this region ever understands what they need to pick at any given time, and they are still struggling a lot this year. There are going to be some hills that I die on, and they're going to be pretty common hills over the course of this video, so we'll go ahead and talk about it. For SK, player of the game for me, it's going to go to Yoppa in the bot lane here. Obviously, Yoppa is a very solid player. He has shown already through his first couple of games that this was probably the best addition that SK had in the offseason, including Mickey X and Wunder. I don't know, Wunder's been okay. I think he's actually been pretty solid for this team, but Yoppa is a really nice find. I wasn't exactly sure how he was going to perform, with the understanding that Mickey was almost certainly going to be moving around the map and playing for mid lane and playing for jungle a lot more than maybe other supports would, just by nature of the way that this roster ended up coming together. But when they do end up playing for bot lane and allowing him to actually be a centralizing, you know, player and a main character for the team, it really ends up working out for them. He plays the Xayah into the Jhin in this game, and we'll talk about it. Jhin Karma on the other side of this matchup is completely unplayable. Both of these drafts I think are awful, and it just so happens that SK has more power picks, and so they end up winning, but Yoppa ends up, you know, kind of benefiting from that. I think Xayah is a bit underplayed globally right now. This is one of the few things that the LEC is doing that I think other teams around the world would benefit from doing more, and I think we kind of saw why in this particular game. Awesome stuff from him, and he really is kind of the light right now alongside Wunder on this team for the best players on SK, and Wunder definitely deserves some credit here. Trayson is just not adapted to the LEC well. He's basically only had one good game throughout his LEC tenure up until this point, and yeah, Wunder is getting Rumble into Cassante, and this is something I'm very excited to talk about, and, you know, I'll get it out of the way a bit early here, but I will bring it up a couple more times throughout the video. Teams just allowing Rumble to go through bans every single game, it's just ridiculous. I mean, this champion constantly has a 2 or a 3k gold lead, like a 2k plus gold lead on his own on on the top side, and there's no pick in the game that can actually counter it. Every other region has learned that you need to ban out Rumble. The LEC is just so stubborn, or they're just not paying attention. Like, I really cannot genuinely tell you what the purpose is of letting this champion through every single game, but there are so many games that are almost instantly won just because Rumble is generating such a gigantic gold lead on the top side. Obviously, that's not going to happen every game. Sometimes certain players are just better than other players, and certain players are bad at Rumble, which we have seen, and I understand why you might leave it up for them. But someone like Wunder, who's played so much Rumble throughout his career, and somebody who's been quite good in lane throughout this split up until this point, there's just no purpose in leaving this champion up for Wunder to go out and pick. I think it's a massive mistake, and he ends up punishing them pretty heavy. I still don't like SK's draft. Again, I like the Rumble, I like the Xayah Rakan, but I generally don't like Pantheon for LEC teams. It doesn't feel like they press their advantages enough in the early game, but I especially don't think you can play Pantheon with a scaler in the mid lane, and we're going to talk about this a lot more as we go throughout the week. There are so many drafts that I think are just almost innately unplayable because you have Pantheon who basically has to fight pre-15 minutes or else he just is not a champion, and he almost instantly loses the game if he doesn't. And if you draft him with a mid laner that doesn't really want to do that, then you're basically saying that one of your players is going to have to just not do the thing that you drafted your champion for. It's a complete waste of a draft. A ton of LEC teams are doing this right now. No one else in the world is doing this. Like, genuinely, no other teams in the world are picking Pantheon with Azir or Pantheon with Aurelion Sol, as we'll see later on in the week. It just makes me so mad because there's no purpose in drafting these two champions together. But at the end of the day, you know, if you're going into another bad draft on the other side, it ends up working out. So SK walk out on top because Yopa is really good, because Wunder played pretty well. Mickey did a good job of enabling the rest of the team, but SK, you know, really can only beat the bad teams right now. And Heretics is absolutely one of the bad teams. What is this draft? Again, I hate being the guy to just go to draft, but it's just egregious. Like, this is not playable. Sheo picks the Aatrox jungle, which is something that I think can be really viable, but I hate the Cassante into Rumble. I continue to think that this is something that is just, people are picking it because others are picking it. I can't imagine anyone is having fun or feeling good about this matchup coming out down 2,000 gold and not having any impact in team fights. There's just no purpose for picking Cassante into Rumble, and yet the LEC does it constantly. You're picking Jhin Karma on the bottom side to try and quote-unquote win lane against Xayah Rakan. There's no other reason for you to draft Karma if you're not trying to dominate the 2v2, and Jhin just cannot do that. And on top of that, this is a team in Team Heretics that has shown that they really only have one playstyle, which is playing hyper carries on the bot side and allowing games to go long so they can play 5v5 team fights. That's what you are built to do, and you're drafting Orianna with no, like, real good target to put the ball on top of. Maybe it's the Aatrox, but the Aatrox has to be so far ahead in order for that to work, and you have no damage coming down on the bot side because you're playing a 2v2 lane that needs to dominate but can't because they're in a losing matchup, and then also an AD carry that's just off his own playstyle because he wants to play these hyper carries that can really dominate in team fights, and he's not able to do that on Jhin. It's just a disaster class from Heretics in terms of drafting. Almost everything you can do wrong, they did wrong in this game, and obviously, the gameplay is just as bad, but whoever, I mean, dud of the game here is the draft. Like, if you really want to be clear on that, and I hate saying that because you guys know me, I'm really not someone who likes to say, oh, draft diff. I think most games are winnable. It just becomes so hard to win when you go against your own ideology and you're picking a bad comp. Like, at least pick one side to be on if you're Team Heretics here. Ice, for me, is going to get dud of the game because the Jhin was entirely useless. This guy was doing nothing throughout the end of the game, and I still think that that is the biggest problem. Ice is a player that is probably the central force for how Heretics are going to win games. It's putting him on hyper carries and letting him dominate 5v5s, and if he can't do that, they're not going to win. Sheo looked pretty bad on the Aatrox. We've seen multiple other players in this region look okay on it. Aatrox, I think, is really strong, but this was not a good game to try and take over there. Saren has just been really lackluster. He's bad in lane, and he's not really done anything outside of lane. Trayson has been underwhelming. Stend, I think, has been okay, but what are you supposed to do on Karma in this game? It's just hard to imagine a world where Team Heretics wins this because they were put so far behind in the early game, and their bad players continue to underperform. But SK are going to be happy to walk out of here with a win, you know, trying to get themselves back on board, trying to get some confidence. There is potentially something to build on here for SK, but it's going to take a lot more than a win over Heretics to completely convince me that you are back. Then moving on to our second game of day number 1, and this was a big one. Two teams that have done really well for themselves at the start of the year. It was Na'Vi taking on GIANTX, and GX is going to pick up the victory here. These were the teams that were really fighting it out to be considered, I think, the best of the rest in the LEC right now. I think top 4 is just kind of something that I need to see in the playoffs, someone like break through in order to believe that they are going to continuously break through. Like, as much as I really like the tape that GX and Na'Vi have shown throughout this year, I need to see that in a best of 5, like, these teams can take take down G2 and KOI and Fnatic and these teams that are above them in that top 4. But in terms of being the best teams in that middle cluster of these, teams that we kind of expected to be in the middle of the pack, it's clear that these are the 2 best. And GIANTX in this game, I think, proving that they deserve to be on the top of that, just like they were for basically all of last year. They got 5th in their 3 splits in 2025. And right now they're on pace to maybe even do better than that because they really are playing great. And it feels like a lot of these players are stepping up. For Navi, it's frustrating, I think, to see them lose this one. I think that there were some moments that looked okay from them generally, but this is, again, a very aggressive draft. I'm not going to criticize these drafts nearly as much. I think there are some, critiques to have, but generally I think both of these games are playable, and Navi just couldn't really get things going around the pike in terms of the plays that you want to make with the Realm Warp, so just didn't really end up working out. But let's go ahead and get into what actually happened in the game itself. Starting, I guess, with the GX side, as we do here, player of the game for me is going to go to Isma in the jungle. He gets his pentakill at the end of this one on the Xin Zhao, although it's kind of a dubious pentakill because he kills Paris twice. I didn't think that that was something that could happen in terms of the cooldown timer for pentas, but hey, still a pentakill for Isma here in the LEC. This guy has been playing a ton better this year, and I think we really started to see a lot of that improvement towards the end of last year as well. Really, it's just getting out of the SK system that has consistently done a lot of, teams and players harm. I guess I'll just say a lot of rosters harm in terms of what SK has put together. It was funny. I went on this big rant in my LCK video yesterday about DN Supers or the Freaks in general, like that whole organization, talking about how they are clearly the worst at being able to, do anything in the world, like in terms of a top level league. Like they are the ones that are constantly taking players in, making them worse, and then just losing every single year, underperforming despite bringing in players that should be doing better. SK gives them a pretty good run for their money. The only thing I'll say about SK is that I think their rosters on paper have always been significantly weaker than that of the Freaks or the Supers. That, at the very least, the Supers have expectations, whereas SK, often underperforms either way. And Isma getting out of that system and getting onto a GX team that is clearly clicking right now, that has good coaching, that understands the way they want to play the game, that has a fantastic bot lane to play off of. It's really helping his development. And this was a guy who looked pretty good as a rookie, or at the very least at the start of his rookie campaign, as a very aggressive early jungler. Somebody that would gank a lot at level 3 and level 4. I think these aggressive types of, junglers that are kind of in meta right now, getting that mid lane and bot lane, snowballing, I think it's a really good meta for Isma to take over, and he is doing so at the moment. He looked fantastic. Jun is the other player here that I want to give a big shout out to on the Bard. He really kind of maybe deserved player of the game. It's between him and Isma. I really don't think there's a wrong choice between those two, but both of them were excellent. Jun has been as advertised so far this year. I claim that he was right up there in contention for being the best support in the entire region before the year started, and he's been exactly that. He's right up there with Busio and with, I guess, someone like Alvaro, although I don't know, maybe June's like coming in at number 2 for me right now in terms of just like raw production. I really do think he's been that good for GIANTX, and I think he is showcasing that this team was correct to keep him around, despite the fact that he was getting interest from Fnatic and from other teams. Noah is still fantastic, very much outplayed Samdi in the laning phase on the Ezreal. Had to play a little bit safer because of the Pyke, but generally the Ezreal gives you a lot of that stability, and he played team fights really well. Jackies and Lot are fine. Lot has been pretty solid and definitely was better on the top side than Mainter, who we will talk about here, but Jackies just continues to be a player that I want to see more out of. He just feels very average to me right now in the way that he is producing, and that's very similar to what he was last year. Again, there are things that I think GIANTX needs to work on if they want to go even higher in the standings than like top 5. Like if they want to get into that top 4 or even that top 3, if they, can really get there. I think there are some improvements that need to be made, but the best players on this team are performing well, and it feels like everybody is kind of, doing their job at the current moment. And then for Navi on the other side, dud of the game was really obvious for me. This is going to Mainter on the top side. When you get Rumble, again, a pick that is constantly up 2,000 gold every single game, both in the LEC and every other region in the world right now, you need to do something with it, and he did not look comfortable on the Rumble at all. This is one of the worst Rumble games you will see all year long. Mainter is a player that I had some reservations on. I generally had reservations on most of the top laners coming in as rookies here in 2026. I said the same thing about Imperos that I did about Mainter, where I just thought it would take some time, and I think we are kind of seeing that there are some ups and downs. Mainter has generally been the best of the rookie top laners, at least in my opinion, especially in comparison to Imperos and then Trayson, who I think has really underperformed from my perspective. But this was a good example that not everybody is going to come in as a finished product, and that there is a lot of work that still needs to be done at the LEC level. Relich, which is, of course, now the way I know to pronounce this player's name. As you guys know, I don't always watch with commentary, and so I get a lot of pronunciations wrong. It made a lot of sense to me for it to be Rylek, just in terms of how it broke down, but Relich is, of course, the way that they pronounce it on the broadcast. He's still the best player on this team, and it's not particularly close right now. I think Poby is doing a good job. Paris, I think, has been good at the start of this year, but he was creating on the Wukong and was trying to go toe-to-toe with Isma, but fortunately, Isma just had a better team to play around, and the Xin Zhao just kind of got fed because of that. Poby was not very good on the Rise that they really wanted to prioritize early on in this draft phase, and then, of course, Paris on the Pike got his kills and got some, resets and some gold for his team, but generally, that pick did not really have a lot of impact on the game, and I don't really like Pike in competitive play. I especially don't really like Pike unless you are like way better than the team you're playing into, which was clearly not the case here. It's kind of hard to convert Pike leads into actual map control in professional play. But overall, I'm not super concerned about Na'Vi. I still think they have a lot of good going for them. I just think GIANTX really is that good. This is maybe even a top 3 or 4 team in the LEC right now, with a lot of other teams underperforming. We'll see how things end up breaking down towards the end of this week, but they are doing everything they need to do in their power right now to be near the top of the standings, to get themselves into a good spot going into playoffs. And with all the cohesion and just the general talent level of this team, it's pretty reasonable to expect them to continue to do well this split. Then moving on to our third game of day number 1, and we get yet another upset and a bit of a comeback here as we saw Shifters taking on Fnatic, and Shifters are going to pick up the victory. This team looked dead in the water last week, let's be entirely honest. It felt like a lot of the good things that they had going for them in week number 1 that caused me to believe that they could actually be the best of that middle group, like we were talking about with GIANTX and Na'Vi. Like, all of that went away in week number 2, where they just looked completely inept. Their mid games were horrible, their drafts were bad, and they just didn't really have a good understanding of what they wanted to do. Someone like Bukata was really scaring me as a player that did not feel very LEC caliber, but coming out here with a comeback win over Fnatic is really encouraging. I am still concerned about Shifters. I'm certainly not back on the train or anything like that, but the fact that they can win a game like at all against a good team right now in the LEC is a good sign for Fnatic. As much as I really want to like this team, they have so many problems right now. Their bot lane continues to perform incredibly well. I think Lospa has, really adjusted to the LEC well. We kind of expected him to be good basically from day number 1, and Upset is obviously just a good player overall, but their solo laners are not adjusting well at the current moment, and it definitely is keeping them out of upper echelon conversations. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the game for me is going to Rooster on the top side here for the Rek'Sai. Rooster was my dud of the week for all of week number 2. It felt like he was in a ton of winning situations and just couldn't really do anything with them. He was making massive mental mistakes, and it was clear that it was kind of tilting the rest of his team. Obviously Nuke, somebody who's kind of been known for potentially being a bit more harsh on his teammates in the past, and so he never really knew what the general vibe was, I guess, surrounding Shifters coming out of that second week where everything was just kind of going awry, but Rooster bounces back with a really nice game here. He dominates lane and then ends up really, really useful in the later part of the game as well. The Rek'Sai is generally a pick that I think is a bit underutilized right now, and what do you know, banning out Rumble ends up making things work out for a lot of teams right now. It's just interesting how things go. So credit to Rooster. He played really well, and it's a nice bounce back from a player that I think I just had such high expectations for that I was really frustrated that he wasn't living up to them. We'll talk about Imperos on the other side. He is really struggling to adjust to the LEC level of competition right now. I think Nuke is continuously the best player on this team. There are a lot of mid laners right now that I think are holding up their team by every strap that they possibly can, and Nuke is definitely one of them. He is the only guy on this team that's playing even remotely consistent, and it's good to see that he does have that form back, but you need somebody else on the team to step up. As much as I like Nuke, he's not really a 1v9 type of player. He's not going to drag your team to wins. He kind of just wants to be one of the best players on the Rift and not like the only good player on the team. So the Azir looks good. He was much better than Vladi in this one. He probably is a better player than Vladi right now, just in terms of how things are breaking down, and that is a good sign for Shifters. Paddock and Trimby, I think, continue to develop their chemistry a bit more. I want to see Paddock be more aggressive. That was what was working for this team at the beginning of the year. Trimby, I think, is just generally a good player, but Paddock is starting to concern me with his passiveness, quite frankly, because it's not just, it's really just not who he is as a player, which is frustrating. And then Bukata still has plenty of faults, but I think something like Skarner is actually really nice for this team because it gives him such a clear way to win the game. So credit to Shifters. They were behind for basically all of this game. Bukata's early game was not particularly good. The bot lane wasn't doing well in the 2v2. Like, there were some real concerns, but at the end of the day, if you can win the fights that you need to, make that Baron for Nexus trade that every team in the LEC just keeps making over and over again because their macro isn't very good, then you're going to be able to get yourself a win. And then for Fnatic on the other side, I'd love to rip this team for how they lost this game because it's got to be super frustrating for Fnatic fans that you don't end up walking out of this with a win after the way the early game goes. But I think there are still positives to take away from the fact that you were able to generate a lead, just not capitalize on it. I generally like their draft. I think Pantheon Talia is the way to play Pantheon right now, and I think we saw that in the early game. Razork was moving around the map and got to play a lot more aggressive than a lot of the other Pantheons that we're going to see throughout the rest of the week because he actually had backup from the rest of his team. Upset and Luspa continue to look very good, I think, as a bot lane 2v2. Luspa in particular is a really good player, and I'm really excited to see if he can continue to grow, but the solo laners are not clicking. Imperos, for me, is going to get out of the game. He was not nearly as good as Rooster was in or out of lane on the top side, and quite frankly, he has just not been very good for this team at the start of the year. I was in favor of them moving on from someone like Razork, and I even was in favor of someone like Imperos coming in. I thought he was one of the better options available, especially the later we went into the offseason, but he is not a finished product. Like, he is not a good laner yet, and he has a lot to work on outside of lane as well. This guy is going to need some time to grow. Hopefully, Fnatic will give him that time because you never really want to see these rookies kind of get the cord pulled on them like too early on in their career, but he has started out very bad, and he is definitely the weak link for Fnatic right now on the top side. But Vladi has also, I think, struggled to adjust, and it's not just the fact that I think he's been bad in a couple of games, because he's been good in a couple of games as well. I would say it's been about 50-50 in terms of like positive versus negative for Vladi, but that's just not really good enough for what the expectations were when you brought him in. He's also not really playing the same kind of style he played on K-Corp. It feels a lot more feast or famine right now than it did when he was on that team. He was a really good facilitator and somebody that was awesome on things like Talia, moving around the map on K-Corp, and it just doesn't really feel like he has that same kind of energy right now to play with Razork as he did with Yike. I imagine it might just take some time or just generally some communication in order to get on that page, but there are real problems with Fnatic that they have to work through in order to actually be an upper tier team. I still think there is a lot to be excited about here. Again, the bot lane just looks really good, but Fnatic are certainly not a provenly great team. Like, they might be closer to GIANTX than they are to the top two right now, which would be frustrating. But for Shifters, this is a super important win. Like, if you had lost this, and then obviously, like, it's not like things get easier on your schedule. If you start, you know, hemorrhaging wins and just starting to go lower and lower in the standings, I mean, you're talking about a team that's kind of on the Team Heretics pace on that front, especially with mid games as bad as theirs. But at the end of the day, they were able to come back and salvage this bad mid game and salvage this bad early game and be able to get themselves into a position to win. And that's what you want to see. It's not always going to be clean and perfect here in the LEC, but as long as you're able to pick up wins, that's what really matters. Then moving on to our fourth game of day number 1, and it's a pretty predictable outcome, unfortunately. At this point, it was K-Corp Blue taking on G2 Esports, and G2 is going to pick up the win, but boy, did they have to work a lot harder for this than I think a lot of people expected them to. This team is not clicking right now. There is like a real problem going on with G2 in terms of the way that they are playing the early game. They just do not have an understanding of what they're supposed to do, and I think the thing that is the most concerning for me is that this is the exact thing that was really causing them to be not good enough throughout a majority of the beginning of the year in 2025. When you're talking about them underperforming in winter, you know, and not making it to first stand and then making it to MSI, but being a team that is just quite frankly bad at that tournament and not looking competitive, it's because their early games were just so bad in comparison to a lot of other teams at those tournaments. And you know what? It's completely regressed into being that again. They're not good in lane. They don't really have a good understanding of how to play advantages or even how to play safe and slow with things like Azir and Aphelios, and it's really costing them. KCB put up a great fight, but it's their lack of experience, quite frankly, their nerves, their worries that end up really costing them in this game around that Baron. I mean, if you play that a bit more aggressively, do things end up changing? I don't know, but you basically give G2 a free Baron and the game kind of ends. It really is frustrating to see that the team was kind of so close to being able to pick up a win here, and they just weren't able to capitalize on it, but still a ton of positives to take away overall for KCB. I think basically everybody on their team played well here today. Let's go ahead and talk about it from the G2 side, because if you don't like victory laps, this might not be the review for you. And trust me, that will continue on throughout the rest of the week. But Caps is going to get my player of the game. How could it go to anyone but Caps? He almost single-handedly wins the game in that Baron fight. I get that the broadcast, or I guess the fans technically voted on Skewmon to get it. And Skewmon was great in this game, and he continues to be someone that I'm super impressed by. I said last week when he got my player of the week for the entirety of the LEC that he is like holding G2 up by himself right now with a pair of duct tape and just trying to figure out how to save every single one of his lanes. But I think Caps was the guy in this game, and this is the performance that we were waiting on from Caps to kind of show, hey, I still can just be so scary and so intimidating on my own, you know, that we can win games off of my presence alone. And that's exactly what it was. He danced around Baron. He bought enough time for the rest of his team, and KCB did not want to take the bluff, and the game is kind of over from there because they're not willing to pull the trigger longer. Caps was enormous in the back end of this game on the Azir, and I really don't think they win it without him being him. Like, without Caps even having the nameplate, right? Like, I actually think that the nameplate diff was massive in this game. So credit to Caps. There's a reason, you know, Baby Faker, I think, is such an apt nickname. It's because his playstyle is almost identical, and he kind of garners the same kind of respect in his own region on the map as well, and initiates that kind of fear. But again, Skewmon continues to be excellent. He's one of the best players in the entire league right now. I would say pretty clearly the best jungler in the LEC in terms of the way that he has started off the year, which is really good to see. You know, I'm going to take a victory lap later and, you know, continue to take a victory lap on a couple of players down on the bot side for G2, but one of the things that I've just gotten wrong at the beginning of this year is that Skewmon's progress would not be so linear, right? Like, he is just getting better every single game, which I think is encouraging in the same way that Yike kind of did for this team before they ended up going to get Skewmon. Broken Blade was also fine generally on the Scion. He's not exactly supposed to dominate in the early game. This is one of his more stable games of the split, even if he has been a bit of a liability for them so far. But it's Hans and Labrov who are consistently putting this team on the back foot. Again, this is the victory lap, man. If you don't believe me now, I don't know when you're going to believe me. Like, at some point, and I get it, I'm probably still going to get comments every single time I rank 80 carry players, but at some point, people are going to be able to look at my ranking of number 5 for Hans Sama in terms of 80 carries in the LEC, and looking at my ranking of like 5 or 6 for Labrov in terms of support rankings, and be like, you know what, maybe he was on to something, because it's just so clear to me watching this guy play games that he is not the one generating leads for himself right now. These two are not in a spot where they're consistently winning the 2v2, and in fact, they got almost entirely outplayed here. I get it. You're playing Aphelios, Alistar into Corki and Nautilus, but the destruction that was going down on the 2v2 for Hazel and Prime, like the advantages they were able to generate by playing so aggressive, Hans and Labrov were not good enough to be able to fight their way back. Now, Hans was great in that final team fight. The Aphelios finally got online, and he was able to get to the point where he could play, and maybe you can say that that's Aphelios' job, is to get blasted in the early game and then to, you know, step up in team fights. And I would generally kind of agree, but not to this degree, right? Like, he just misplayed over and over again in the laning phase. Labrov as well. This was a 2v2 gap in favor of KCB, and Hans got bailed out by the fact that his mid-jungle duo could buy enough time for him to get online in the Baron pit. So still major problems for G2. Their early games are still just trash. Like this is genuinely one of the worst early game teams in the entire league in terms of how they play, but their team fighting is so good, and genuinely they are so clutch, you know, especially Skewmon and Caps, that they can get away with a lot more than I think the rest of the league can. For KCB, I just want to give them a lot of flowers. I didn't really want to give a dud of the game here because I think almost everybody played well. I have to, because it's my format, but I'm giving it to Kamalu. Just, I think he overstepped a little bit too much on the Talia. I think more aggressive trigger pulls from him probably end the game in a positive way, and Kamalu has always just been a bit of an indecisive player, and that really ended up costing them here. But how can I sit here and say that he had a bad game? Same thing with Yukino on the Pantheon. Same thing with Hazel and Prime, who were excellent. I think Hazel and Prime in particular, was kind of the star of the game for me for KCB in terms of the way he played the early laning phase. These guys were awesome, and Prime has been somebody that I've been really impressed by, even if this team has not found the success that they were looking for. Same kind of thing for Tao on the top side. I think he's been good. He's had some really bad moments, and I think he could have been a tad bit more relevant in this game, but I'm not really upset at KCB in terms of the performance here. I think they did just about as well as they could. They just didn't have the mental and the wherewithal to be able to pull the trigger to end this game, to pick up the win. I think if you had more veterans on this team, perhaps that ends up working out. Kamalu being the only player who's ever played in Tier 1 before does not help this team's success or chances of success right now in the league, but the fact that they can go toe-to-toe and even generate leads against a team like G2 is a good sign for them, that these players are on the right track. But it's a bad sign for G2. As much as I'd love to walk out of here and be like, Caps and Skewmon, they're so good, because they are, and they're playing really well, and Caps is getting into form, Skewmon's been great. Like, Hans and Labrov are concerning. Broken Blade is almost a complete non-factor on the top side right now. This team has a ton of problems that they need to fix, and if they don't fix them soon, this is genuinely going to be a team that continues to struggle even at the LEC level. Then moving on now to game number 5 of day number 1, and we keep the upsets rolling as we saw Team Vitality taking on K-Corp, and Team Vitality are going to pick up the victory here in what is almost certainly the cleanest game of the day up until this point. You know, I would sit here and be surprised and pretend to be like, oh man, K-Corp losing to Vitality, what's going on? I'm not surprised by this at all. I don't think anybody should be surprised by this. This is exactly what we were talking about with Vitality as a team, just in general. They are going to beat the best teams in the league. They're going to lose to the worst teams in the league. It's the way that they are constructed. When you bring Humanoid and Karzi together, when you have this organization in general kind of built around a lot of these more feast or famine players, you are going to have times where you look fantastic. You're going to have times where you look terrible, and you just have to try to find the middle ground of what that potentially looks like. This is a fantastic win for Vitality because of the way that they won the game, but I'm I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I'm all in on Vitality after one game of this, because we've seen this story before with these teams. I just will not. I refuse to believe it until I actually see it over an extended period of time. And for K-Corp, as much as I want to be frustrated here, they lost in draft. I mean, this is a hard game to play. You give over Jace jungle, which is the strongest pick in the game right now. Ezreal Karma absolutely dumpsters your 2v2, and you picked Pantheon with a mid laner who cannot roam at all, like who can't even attempt to try and roam around the map. It's just a really tough game for K-Corp to play out. And they got punished for it. And obviously that sucks. But if this were a best of 3, a best of 5, do I think they guarantee lose this? You know, I'm not quite sure, even if they were bad in this particular game. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Fleshy in the support position. I think that this is debatable. And the reason for that is because you pick Ezreal Karma to dominate this 2v2. And Fleshy kind of wasn't very good in the laning phase. Like the part of the game that you were supposed to be the most effective in as this duo, I think that's where Fleshy played the worst. But the moment we started hitting one item power spikes and he started to move around the map and play alongside Linsauce and be this big, you know, poke combo to play alongside the Realm Warp and just kind of get his team into positions where they could control space and just, you know, poke out what is essentially the weakest front line that you could possibly have for K-Corp outside of the Alistar with ultimate on the other side. That's when Fleshy really started to just unlock this entire game plan. His ability to pull aggro from basically the entirety of K-Corp baiting fights into the rest of his team where they could just immediately win the game. Like it's just special stuff. Fleshy has really shown a lot. Really excited that he got another shot at tier 1 play after his time in North America, and I'm pretty sure you can say without a doubt at this point that he is making the most of it. He has looked fantastic. I think this is debatable, if only just because I think that there are some up and down moments, generally speaking, from, you know, Fleshy in this game. Nako was also in consideration for me on the Cassante. You know, I want to take a victory lap for Hansama. Well, I gotta, you know, go the other direction as well when it comes to Nako, who I was like, I just don't know if he's going to be that in year number 2. I think the potential is at like a 99, but I think the current ability might be a bit lower than people think it is right now. Yeah, I'll eat the L on that. This guy's a top 3 top laner right now in terms of how he is playing, going into Kana and having this kind of aggression and doing so well in a lane matchup that I think is really tough into a player that knows how to punish it. It's special stuff. This guy really is like living up to the hype right now in terms of the top side. Linsauce, I think, is better than people give him credit for. When Humanoid and Karzi are going deathless in games like this, you know things are working out well. Humanoid had a couple of great realm warps in this game, and Karzi, I think, generally was just kind of locked in on the game plan here. Vitality looked fantastic. They played this game super clean from a macro perspective, and also I think they did a really good job of, you know, winning fights and outperforming KC in and out of lane. Generally just a fantastic performance from a team that you hope can carry this through. You just don't really know what you're going to get out of them on a game-to-game basis. For K-Corp on the other side, of course I'm frustrated. Like, I'm not happy with the result that we got here for a team that should be the best in the entire league and that showed a lot of good things, was first place in the LEC coming out of last week by themselves. But at the end of the day, this is a hard draft to play. Again, Pantheon Cassiopeia I think is really tough. You're going into this big poke comp and really all you have to deal with that is Alistar full engaging, and there's no real way for him to do that all that easily. Like, this is a hard game to play from behind, and that's exactly the spot that they were in. Busio for me is going to get dud of the game. Fleshy just completely outplayed him throughout all of this. I mean, the baiting that was going on from the Karma onto the Alistar, like I said, as that kind of being the only form of engage that K-Corp had throughout a lot of this, it made Busio look completely useless throughout this game, and Busio's looked good so far in the LEC. It's not like, oh, he's still taking some time to adjust and get up to form in terms of how he's playing over in Europe. No, he's been playing pretty great and has maybe been the best player for this team at the start of the year, and he just got completely outplayed in this particular game. So big credit to Fleshy. Busio's dead of the game for that. Kaliste also deserves some hate, I would say, for the Sivir. Just did not work out. He was not able to do particularly well outside of the early laning phase where he basically just shoved out and tried to pressure out this Karma. Outside of that, he was almost entirely useless. Yehu, Yike, even especially Kana on the top side, all just kind of behind their competition. On the other side, this felt very anti-K-Corp in the fact that it felt like their hands were kind of letting them down rather than bad macro decisions kind of letting them down. And quite frankly, that's just not something I think is going to be all that consistent for this team. As much as you can sit here and say that I'm defending them too much, I feel like this is a game that is not super replicable for either of these two teams. I don't think K-Corp plays this badly next time they get the opportunity to do this, mostly because I don't think they draft Pantheon Cassiopeia as their mid-jungle duo, but also Vitality were just outplaying them basically everywhere, even in matchups that I think can sometimes be a bit more difficult, like the Cassante into Rumble. Like, these are things that just happen to, you know, go this way on this day. I think K-Corp is going to be just fine, but it is being noted that the circle of suck is still existing and that no team in the LEC looks consistent at all, but a big win for Vitality, especially in terms of standings. This team very much does not want to be anywhere near the bottom 4 in terms of not making it into playoffs, and this is one of those wins that can really get you in a good spot to not do that. But then moving on to our final game of day number 1 here, and we had a certified banger to close out the first day of the week. It was Movistar KOI taking on Los Ratones, and somehow, someway, LR picks up the victory. The day of upsets is certainly not, I guess, fumbling it at the finish line, if you will, because it is following through. Los Ratones being able to get the win here just completely changes what their outlook looks like here in the LEC, not just in terms of the confidence level, because obviously we had started to feel better about this team coming out of the end of week 2 after they were the only team to not pick up a win in week number 1, but beating Movistar KOI and doing so in a way that feels really repeatable, even with their mistakes that they were making throughout a lot of this game. It's really, really encouraging. And for KOI, what are we doing, man? What are we doing losing to Los Ratones? What are we doing losing to a non-LEC team when this was probably the best team in the league through the first couple of weeks? To see them sit here and just underperform so heavily, it just goes to show where the LEC is at right now. Nobody is playing particularly well, and certainly nobody is playing consistent, and I think that is the biggest problem. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the game is going to go to Baus on the top side. I've been decently critical of Baus because I do think the playstyle that he has, while it works in certain moments, is something that is going to get less effective naturally when you start playing against top laners who are more and more mechanically skilled than you. And I get it, like Baus being the kind of player that it doesn't really matter how far down he goes in the early game, he can still be very useful in team fights. That is an archetype that we've seen work at the pro level before. Hell, there are players right now that are doing it at a high level. I think Doran is probably the best example of what a player of that archetype can look like. Doran's gotten better in lane. Obviously, he's not a complete liability. He goes neutral most of his games now, but is definitely much more of a team fight focused player. The problem for Baus is that he's like worse than all of those players in lane. Like it is like a true -10, like in terms of the grading scale, in terms of how that breaks down. So, you know, he has to make sure that he can be as useful as anyone else in the world is in the late game. So when he does play against Mirwin, who's just not a particularly aggressive laner when he's not on his big counter picks, and he gets to play Poppy and he gets a relatively free pass into the late game, he can kind of take over games at this level. That's why we've seen so many teams invest resources into ganking top lane, because this guy needs to be solo killed over and over again in order for you to kind of take him out of the game. And, you know, Baus is susceptible to that. But when it doesn't happen, like it didn't in this game, that Poppy was huge. The ultimates were massive. Poppy in general is just really good into this current meta and into the comp that KOI ended up drafting for themselves. This was a big game for Baus, certainly his best in the LEC up until this point. I don't know how repeatable this is specifically for him, because again, it really just comes down to, oh, Baus, you know, is getting solo killed every single game. Well, this is the game he didn't get solo killed, and now he ends up being fine. Like, other teams are going to punish top lane more like other teams have in the past, but Baus's late game effectiveness is going to translate to any level. That's just the way that his playstyle ends up working. I also do want to give a big shout out to the bot lane. Crownie has been underwhelming, I'll just say, in the LEC so far. He's shown a lot of the negative traits that he showed at the end of last year, and not so much the traits that he showed when he was in the LEC consistently for teams like BDS and SK back in the day. It's good to see him actually have a good game going into a really good bot lane in Supa and Alvaro, one of the best bot lanes in the entire league, a bot lane that started off incredibly well and has played well throughout basically all of this year. For Crownie to come out and be super solid on the Caitlyn and be able to dominate lane into Ezreal Karma, it's a really good sign. Reckless is an enchanter merchant, but boy, is he good at those enchanters. When you get him out of the laning phase, he can still be a little bit more hit or miss, but in that laning phase, he can make a big difference. He just understands matchups really well. This guy's very cerebral, and he's always kind of been that way as an AD carry, but it's especially prevalent here as a support because he doesn't have that well-roundedness that he had as an ADC, that he can dominate in team fights even if he's not ahead. He has to be in good spots, but for the most part, he's done a good job of getting himself there. Nemesis was solid. He's been the best player on this team. Velia is still making tons of mistakes. This guy is really just not an LEC caliber jungler. He was bailed out by the fact that he was playing Dr. Mundo, and nobody in this region knows how to beat this champion because I guess nobody plays Trundle or like anybody else that busts tanks. But at the end of the day, if Velia was playing almost any other champ, this probably goes completely awry as quickly as it possibly can. Luckily for him, everybody else on the team was playing fine, and Los Ratones pull off a massive upset to keep themselves in the playoff race here. And for Movistar KOI on the other side, like, what are we doing, man? Why are we losing games to Los Ratones? Like, how is this even possible to happen? Like, how are your players getting outplayed in 1v1s or 2v2s to get you into this position in the first place? Gold should not even be neutral in this game, let alone Los Ratones winning late game team fights off the back of Poppy being in a great spot. Velia, like I said, was just invading and constantly getting caught, and, you know, he wasn't dying because he's Dr. Mundo, but just making a ton of macro mistakes, and you still weren't
quite able to punish it in the way that you kind of needed to. Elyoya, for me, is going to get done of the game because of that. This was kind of a free game for Elyoya to kind of, I'm not going to say like take over and push forward and really dominate, but this is a guy who has kind of been leading the MVP race for me through the beginning couple of weeks, like the first 2 weeks of the season, and he just needed to be better in this game. I mean, he should be leaps and bounds better than what is, in my opinion, the worst jungler in the league in Velia, and it just didn't really happen. Even with Velia making his mistakes, Elyoya wasn't really there to capitalize on them. I think it's also fair to point out the rest of the team as well, though. I think JoJo needed to be better than he was in this game. Nemesis has easily been the best laner of Los Ratones and has been somebody that has consistently been able to generate leads. He is clearly an LEC caliber mid, so I'm not going to, really crucify JoJo for not being able to dominate that lane matchup, but Supa and Alvaro definitely needed to play better into this Caitlyn Nami. If Crownie and Reckless are a little bit slower on the uptick in terms of how this early game goes, then this game is not very winnable for Los Ratones because they don't really have a lot of damage in the late game. Mirwin as well, being like the only player in the entire league to not solo kill Baus in lane is certainly frustrating. Like, a lot of things just kind of needed to be more aggressive and more clinical from KOI in this one, and it just didn't really happen. I'm not going to sit here and say that they're one of the worst teams in the league, but once again, teams at the top of the standings just cannot stay consistent here in the LEC, and Los Ratones gets to benefit from it. They're just kind of beating all of the teams that have yet to figure out their own identity because they have such a clear one on their own win side, and obviously when they get to play it, it looks good. I still think this team is going to struggle in, like, especially best of fives where their game plan is so limited, and I think especially against LEC teams, like, they need very specific drafts in order to be successful, but those drafts are coming through right now in the regular season, and as we've seen, they're definitely good enough to still pull off wins when they can get the right setup. Then moving on now to day number 2, of course, our middle day of the week here, and kicking off day 2 was a matchup between Shifters and Na'Vi, where Na'Vi is going to pick up the big victory. Again, this is a team that's establishing themselves as kind of the top tier of the middle grouping right now in the LEC, and who knows, again, with teams like G2 and KOI and even K-Corp all just looking so, up and down, like the fluctuation is just so real, is there even really like a clear divide between the top tier and the middle tier? Fnatic is right down there with everybody else right now in terms of the way that they are playing, and Na'Vi, with the momentum that they're able to generate and, just all of the wins that they're picking up in the standings, could very easily be a top 2 or a top 3 seed going into playoffs and a top 4 team in the LEC if you really want to look at it like that. Obviously, they have a couple of other teams they need to compete with for that spot, but this is a very complete team and they know how to play the game. They have a very clear understanding of what their identity is, which I think is really big for this point in the year. For Shifters, we talked about it. This is going to be an inconsistent team because some of their talent is just not performing well right now, and as much as I do like, Nuke, and believe that he individually is playing really well for Shifters, if no one else is going to play well, if Paddock is just going to be super passive on the Kai'Sa and try to play out the scaling war with teams like Na'Vi, if a player like Bukata is going to be one of the weaker junglers in the league, if Rooster and Trimby are going to take some steps back as the split goes along, it's going to be really tough for this team to continue to compete near the top of that middle of the pack. They're going to be closer to 8th or 9th in the league than they are to like top 5, like we thought they would be, or at the very least hoped they would be, because right now their macro is just not good enough to get them there. So let's go ahead and talk about it. For Na'Vi, player of the game is going to go to Sam D. This is another player that I think I've been, low on over the course of this channel's history. I just haven't really seen like high-end potential like traits, and I talk about that a lot for the AD carry role. I think that there are some very specific things that I look at for AD carry to kind of hope and pray that, like, okay, this is what usually AD carries look like before they break out, right? Like, that's usually how you can spot. There are certain things and certain traits in each role that I think are important to kind of identify who is a future star and who is just kind of a good player. I don't think Sam D really has like a lot of star traits. He doesn't really do anything at an expert level. His mechanics are average at best. I would say at times they look below average, but what he is really good at is not making mistakes, and I think that that is decently valuable for a team that has a lot of volatile talent around him, right? Like Paris, Poby, Relich, like Mainter, like these are all players that I think can really get, like they can push the game forward, but they can also be a bit inconsistent because they're either young or they're just naturally more aggressive. I think having an AD carry like Sam D that is a lot more stable, that maybe doesn't have that same kind of upside in terms of like dominating mechanics, but is going to sit down on the bot side and get 500 CS on Sivir and then just take over the game. Like, that's what you need sometimes out of your AD carry, and I think that's what they got out of him in this game. Like I said, he gets to 500 or whatever CS in 40 minutes in this game, something absolutely ridiculous, ends up completely dominating team fights because he just has so much more gold than everybody else. This is what we praise Chovy for over in the LCK. Now, obviously, Chovy does that while also affecting the map, which is just like the game-breaking thing that makes him the best player in the world, but this is pretty close to, the best possible scenario for an AD carry in a situation like this. Just be the stabilizing force down on the bot side and allow the rest of your team to be the ones that allow you to get that lead in the first place, which we are kind of seeing. I think Paris had a pretty good game on the Braum, certainly was better than Trimby, the player that replaced him on Shifters on the other side of this matchup. And then Mainter, I thought was really good in this game on the top side on the Gnar. Obviously some up and down moments in general for him in the LEC, but I think he's, like I said, probably been the best of the rookie top laners. So nice to see that. Relich and Poby, the players that are supposed to be kind of the carries, the ones that are supposed to be pushing the game forward for Na'Vi, were probably the least impactful here, and that's including, Relich on the Jace jungle. He's clearly the only jungler who's actively watching other regions right now, playing things like Aatrox and Jace every single game, and while it's working for him, like, it's cool to see that the rest of the team can win games if need be as well. For Shifters, on the other side, their macro is just bad. Like, they're one of the worst macro teams in the entire league. They have no idea what they're supposed to do when they generate a lead for themselves, and even when they do generate a lead for themselves, it can be inconsistent for them to keep it in the first place. I'm just really low on a couple of these players, so when you don't get good performances out of players like Trimby and Rooster, things just fall off the rails really fast. This was a hard game for them to play. Trimby, for me, is going to get dead of the game, but generally, I think the biggest problem for Shifters is that they lost in laning phases, went down very heavy in gold into a comp with Azir and Sivir, and then didn't really have a way to be able to pull engages back because Na'Vi was playing so slow and so clinical. The game took so long, really only because Na'Vi didn't have a clear way to initiate and engage fights outside of the Braum or the Gnar finding a fantastic engage. For Shifters, if they had been able to pick anyone throughout this game, then perhaps things get a little bit different. You had Gold on Nuke, who was doing great for himself in the mid lane. Paddock wasn't all that. I mean, he was pretty far behind, but that had more to do with the fact that Samdi was just so far ahead and accelerated in terms of gold. But Trimby could never find that hook. He could never find that engage. And for the most part, he was just standing on the front line, dying to the Sivir and dying to the Jace and dying to the Azir and just not really doing much for the team, which I think is a pretty frustrating way to lose the game. If Trimby is not going to be effective in the later part of the game, especially as somebody who is kind of brought in to be a vocal leader for this team, that could be a bit of a problem for Shifters. Rooster also was worse than Mainter on the other side. Again, Rooster needs to consistently be one of the better top laners in the league for this team to live up to their own expectations, because Bukata is not that guy in the jungle to find those engages and to find those initiations, and Paddock, again, is just playing so scared and so passive right now, which is against his own grain, that it really relies on a couple of these players stepping up alongside Nuke, who has genuinely just been really good across this split. So for Shifters, it's frustrating. This is probably the most frustrating team in the entire league to watch because it's so clear that they have the ability to win games. They just don't really know how to put it together right now. And for Na'Vi, it's basically the opposite. They have such a clear idea and identity for how they want to win games and how they want to be able to play things out that they're able to create advantages that other teams aren't able to do as consistently. It's really, really fun to watch them, and they're genuinely going to be a threat moving forward. Then moving on to our second game of day number 2, and this is a big bounce back for Team Heretics as they take on KC Blue and pick up the win in 42 minutes. They needed a result like this in terms of just how their split has been going. They are very quickly becoming one of the weaker teams in the LEC in general, especially with teams like Los Ratones actually performing pretty well. Heretics are very much on the outside looking in right now in terms of what the playoffs might be, looking like for a team like this, and that is just not good enough. Like, this is a team that needs to be better than 11th place, and while this isn't exactly the result that proves that, because an 11th place team would beat the 12th place team in terms of how things are going, at the very least, we kind of got to see them get back on track in terms of their draft and start to go towards the things and play the style that were, like, the things that were working for them earlier on in the split and the things that kind of make sense to work for them throughout the rest of the year. For KCB, they continue to be interesting and, put up a fight in a lot of these games, but they're just not composed. They don't really have a mid to late game. Their late game in particular is just really bad. It's easily the worst of any team in the LEC, and that's to be expected. You have a ton of players that have no tier 1 experience. You have multiple players who don't even have tier 2 experience here with Tao and Hazel, of course. So you would expect their macro to not be perfect in the back end of these games, but Heretics took full advantage of that with yet another Ice pentakill down on the bottom side. Ice, for me, is going to get player of the game. Just kind of has to go in that direction here, and this is what we're talking about with Heretics when you're talking about the way that they want to draft and the way that they want to set up the rest of their team. If they're not playing around a hyper carry on the bot side, I genuinely don't really know what this team's identity is, and that could be a problem as they get later on into the year, because of course it doesn't really feel like Trayson or Saren or anybody, else other than Ice Jace is going to be able to step up as a carry in a lot of these games, but when he is on these hyper carries, instead of the Jhin, even instead of a lot of these lane dominant picks like the Kalista and the Ezreal that we're seeing super commonly, when he's on Yunara or on Kai'Sa or on Jinx, like the identity is much clearer because this guy just wants to play front to back 5v5s and he wants to carry in team fights. That is Team Heretics win condition. That's what's going to be more consistent for them. I think especially picking things like Taliyah in the mid lane, which obviously worked out very well in this game, kind of enable that because it gives you that bridge that I always talk about. That jungle mid duo can play more for the aggressive early game, whereas you have that late game win condition on the bottom side that's going to be able to close out a lot of instances. It's why Vi, Taliyah, Yunara is like the most popular trio draft pick in the world right now in terms of like building a team comp around 3 picks. They are 3 that are some of the most consistent because they're, you know, able to get mid game pressure at the 1-item power spike once you start hitting level 6 and playing around, you know, Vi, Taliyah power spikes, or in this case the Ambessa Taliyah power spike, and then you can transition that of course into your AD carry hyper carrying. It makes a lot of sense, and specifically for Heretics, I think it's really the way that they need to play in order to win games, and I would expect them to play like this for the rest of the regular season. If they're going back to more stable and just kind of balanced draft compositions, they're just going to lose games. They're not as good in these balanced game states. They need to start getting themselves into positions where they can play, you know, around the things they're actually good at. I do want to give some credit to the rest of the team. I think Saren, like I said, played much better in this game than he has regularly. I think this might even be his best game of the split up until this point. It's looked really rough. I thought Saren was going to have a pretty high floor. I've said that a couple of times coming in here to Heretics. It has not been a high floor. It's been a pretty low floor in terms of the results that we are getting. Kamalu has not exactly been great on the other side of this, but Saren was definitely better in this matchup, being the player that replaces Kamalu on this Heretics team. Sheo I thought was solid enough. Trayson I think had a couple of nice ultimates on the Kennen. Stend had a couple of nice engages on the Rakan. Overall, it just felt like a more complete performance from a Heretics team that we kind of wanted to see play a bit more to their own strengths, which is what we saw here. And then for KCB on the other side, I continue to believe that this team is just, you know, a couple of decisions away from actually being relevant at this level, but that's not how League of Legends works. You know, it's one of those things where it doesn't really matter if you stay neutral and are competitive in a lot of games. If your late game is bad, if you have no idea how to close out games, you're not a particularly good team. And the difference between being a good team and being KCB, who's by themselves at the bottom of the standings right now, is being able to close out games. So it's just frustrating to see how this breaks down. Hazel for me is going to get dud of the game here. The positioning on the Kai'Sa in this one, quite bad. This is where you see that tier 3 to tier 1 jump that I think, you know, a lot of players really struggle with. I was really excited about the way he was playing laning phases in previous games, especially on day number 1 of this week, but if you're not going to be good in the 5v5, if you're going to be easily the weakest AD carry in the game in that, you know, phase, or at least in the league in that phase of the game, it's just going to be really tough, especially when you're playing things like Kai'Sa with a comp that needs an Azir to be able to kind of dominate in the back half. If you're not going to be positioned correctly, and if you're going to be dove upon by the Rakan and by the Kennen and by the Ambessa, then it's just going to make life a lot more difficult, especially on something like Kai'Sa, where you basically have to play perfect throughout a lot of these 5v5s. Prime was also not particularly good in this one. Going to cut him a bit of slack. It's kind of difficult to play Alistar in this composition that they've ended up drafting for themselves. Tao on the top side has been fine. Again, I think I might have been hyping him up a little too much in terms of the earlier weeks. He's just kind of been okay for KCB. Yukino continues to be the shining light for K-Court Blue, which is really exciting. You know, Yukino being a player that I think a lot of people are excited about. I don't think he's been as good as he was in the first couple of games of the split, but I still think he's been solid and definitely a productive player. KCB are fun to watch, but they're not particularly effective. They're the worst team in the league, and Heretics at the very least are going to be able to pick up a win against a team they should. The question now is, are they able to kind of learn that, hey, this is the style that works for us, we should start playing this more consistently, or are they immediately going to go back to doing a lot of the negative drafting that they were doing in the first couple of games? That remains to be seen, but at the very least we know that they can pick the things that we expect them to be good at and actually perform on them right now. Then moving on to our third game of day number 2 and kind of the end of the first half of the week here, as we got a big matchup in the middle of the standings between Team Vitality and GIANTX, where Vitality are going to pick up another very big back-to-back win for themselves. Vitality looked fantastic through the beginning of week number 3, and, you know, I can't really say that I'm all that surprised, not because I didn't have this team low in the power rankings. Number 8, I think, was a pretty respectable place to put them with the way that they had been playing. Number 7, I think, was probably where most people would put them after Shifters went 0-3 last week, but Shifters had a tougher schedule. Vitality still had some things that they needed to work through, and I thought the inconsistency was still there, but at the end of the day, when this team is on, they click. Like, they really, really work, and you can see some fantastic games out of a team that clearly has some great mental going on right now. But as for GIANTX on the other side, this is a bit of a disappointing loss. I mean, this team has kind of been on fire at the start of this year. This was their chance, especially with the Corp loss on day number 1, to push themselves like into first place and really be a team that could, kind of guarantee themselves not only a playoff berth, but like a high seed and, a lot of expectations going into the end of split number 1. And this is exactly the spot where every other team in the LEC has also kind of lost the plot and kind of thrown away their big advantage. It feels like nobody wants first place in this league right now, and it's just kind of insane to see how things are breaking down. But let's go ahead and talk about this game in particular. Player of the game was kind of hard because I think this really was a team victory for Vitality. You don't often in the LEC at the very least get games where it feels like all 5 members are contributing equally, where the map was kind of the big success. The macro was definitely, positive, and it just kind of felt like every play was going in favor of Vitality. I think that there are multiple players here. In fact, all 5 you could really make a case for being player of the game, and I think that that is a good thing. I landed on Humanoid in the mid lane despite the KDA because somehow, some way, you're playing Aurelion Sol with Vi, which, by the way, I want to make this clear. I've talked a lot about draft. I think Aurelion Sol is unpickable in this meta right now. I know we've seen a couple of players both pick and at times have success on this champion, but I really don't think that has anything to do with the champ itself. If you are letting Aurelion Sol scale into the late game, I think you've lost the plot, especially because you're picking something like Bard in the support position. If you're picking Asol, especially with something like Vi in the jungle, first off, Vi really has no targets to play with in this game, and then Ezreal is going to kind of have to carry the load in the early game on the bot side. He's going to have to fight a ton at one item, and you've got something like a Bard that isn't exactly perfectly equipped to do that. You would much prefer, obviously, something like a Karma or a Corki Nautilus or really any other dominant 2v2 lane Kalista Renata down on the bottom side to pair up with that Aurelion Sol, at least in the way that the current meta is operating. But generally, I think Aurelion Sol just takes too many resources in order to make work right now. That being said, if you are able to out-roam and out-shove your mid lane opposition as Aurelion Sol, yeah, you deserve to win that game. Like, it just is what it is. This is a champion that I think is at an inherent disadvantage because scaling in the mid lane right now, I think, is at an inherent disadvantage. But he was able to get out on the map. He was much more active than Jackie's in terms of the plays that were happening, and that to me was the most important thing towards opening up the rest of Vitality's game plan. Linsauce cannot play this game if Humanoid loses mid lane pressure early on, which, again, by all intents and purposes, he absolutely should have. This is a GX draft gap in favor of themselves, and somehow, some way, Vitality end up walking out of here with a victory because of that mid lane priority. So, big credit to Humanoid. Linsauce was the player who I think benefited the most from that priority, and you got to give him a lot of credit. I think he's been pretty good across this split. I know that there are a lot of people online that kind of disagree with my excitement about this player, but I do still believe in him as a potential top half jungler. I'm not exactly sure he's there right now, but with a lot of the inconsistency in that role, can he be top 6-ish in the league? Yeah, I think it's totally possible for him to be in that area. Nako was fantastic. Lot made a ton of very easily fixable mistakes. Again, this is not the fault of Rumble, the champion, more so the fault of just Lot playing that champion not particularly well. Carzzy goes deathless, and I think a lot of that is his great positioning. He had a great game here. He's really reined in a lot of his more explosive tendencies and is actually playing pretty well at the start of this year. And Fleshy, I already kind of went on a positive rant about him at the beginning of this episode. Vitality is just kind of looking good through their first 2 games. If they can end out this week 3-0, I mean, you're actually looking at a team that could be a lot closer to being top 5 in the league right now than we ever thought. And that's because GX kind of unanimously held that spot for a lot of different people. I'm not out on GX after 1 game. I do think they kind of threw this one away. They played bad for basically no reason, specifically Lot and Isma on the top side of the map. I think we're really poor in this performance. I think Lot was just horrible. He made one of the worst plays I've ever seen, which is actively walking into a fully powered Scion Q with vision on him in a lane gank coming in from Linsauce. It's just one of those plays that, I would be flaming my teammates in Diamond if they were making this, let alone, the GIANTX top laner, right? You can't be making these kinds of mistakes. It's just not really something that you can get away with. Isma as well in the jungle, I think, just got completely out jungled by Linsauce. This game is so much easier for the Jarvan than it is for the Vi in terms of playing things out, mostly again because of what is the presumed mid and bot lane priority with Bard likely roaming around the map alongside the Vi. You should have a ton of pressure in basically every single lane, and yet somehow Isma was behind in tempo to the Vi on the other side of the map. It's really just not acceptable, in my opinion, coming in from him, and this is kind of the problem, right? Isma has never been a good player at playing from a bad game state. He is somebody that really relies upon the fact that his laners are doing well and needs them to kind of push forward. There are a lot of junglers that are like that in the current game, but I think Isma is somebody that I've been lower on because it does feel like he requires his team to step up. And Lot, while he's good on weak side, this is a lane you kind of have to punish, and he was making too many aggressive mistakes in this one. He didn't feel particularly comfortable on the front foot. These are real concerns. Noah and Jun have been fantastic, but Jackie's has not been very good, and I am worried about the top side in terms of if they can actually elevate the rest of the team. And because of that, GIANTX still has some major question marks. Again, everybody in the middle of the standings right now in the LEC has major concerns, but it's Vitality who are coming out on top in a lot of these games. And while the inconsistency is definitely still there, as we saw from the beginning of the split, you have to hope that this is becoming a more realistic outcome for them, that they can genuinely be a top 5 team in the league, because right now they are performing like it. Then moving on to game number 4 here of day number 2 as we head into the back half of our week. And we, I guess, got the back half started here with the matchup between SK Gaming and Movistar KOI, where KOI are going to pick up the victory, and they kind of needed this one after a surprise loss on day 1 to Los Ratones. You wanted to be able to bounce back and look as good as possible in day number 2, and that's exactly what they did here. I think they got back to their roots. They basically played exactly how they had been playing throughout the beginning of the split. The only exception right now is that JoJo is just kind of off his game. This is like 3 games in a row now where JoJo has just felt really slow in terms of being able to move around the map, and he hasn't felt particularly locked in. He does this all the time. As somebody who's watched every game of his professional career and covered all of it on this channel, this is just what Jojo Pune does. Like, he did this for Evil Geniuses in North America. He's going to do it here for KOI in Europe. It's just, he'll have stretches of time where he's not particularly consistent, and especially he's going to look inconsistent when it comes to actually being able to play the map. He can sometimes just get a little bit locked on his lane matchup, especially when you give him a counter pick like this, where it's like, you were drafting the Anivia specifically to play into the Rise. Like, there is not really a huge other point to pick Anivia in the meta right now, but for SK on the other side, their problems still run pretty deep. They were able to pull off that win against Heretics on day number 1 to kind of quell some of the bleeding, but it's not really enough. Like, this team still has some major issues and some major problems with the way that they play, and quite frankly, there are multiple players on this team that are just in bad form right now, which is not a good combination. Let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the game is going to go to Elyoya in the jungle. Gave him dead of the game for the Los Ratones game. I'm not sure that that's going to be the most popular opinion, and some people might, criticize that down in the comments. Well, there's no debate that he was player of the game in this one. This was a masterclass from him on the Vi. This champion is so effective when you utilize it correctly, and when you're able to play the map and, use that level 6 power spike and play really aggressive around getting something like a Yunara or a Rumble in a really good spot. I usually like to do that with a roaming mid laner. Again, Anivia, not so much a part of that equation, but when Elyoya is so good and he can make so many plays on his own and out-tempo basically all of SK Gaming without really a ton of assistance, then yeah, you can probably justify having 3 scaling lanes and just relying on the Vi to be able to create for you. Was a really good look, and Elyoya, to me, still has been the best player in the LEC over the course of this split so far. We'll see how that ages. Obviously, you've got a couple of more days, a couple of more games from other teams and everything like that, but he has been spectacular for a team that I think has generally been very good in the regular season. Do want to give a big shout out to Alvaro, a really good Lulu game. He's been limit testing a lot on these enchanters throughout the regular season so far. Some games have looked great, some games have looked not so great, and I think generally you just want to try and find that balance in the middle of it. He is starting to get much better at playing these enchanters. We obviously know he can play the engagers, especially the tank engagers, and find his way into the backline and, do the thing that we know the most from Alvaro, which is even from losing game states, find one of the most creative angles that you can to initiate a fight and get his team back into the game. It's good to see him be able to do the opposite now and play for the 2v2 and really get Supa ahead, who's on the hyper carry, in this case on the Yunara. Bot lane in general, I think has looked solid. Mirwin was better than Wunder on the top side. Mirwin's been okay, I would say, over the course of this split. Sion, I believe, suffers his first loss in the LEC in this one. It's kind of funny that Rumble is not the Omega pick in the top lane in terms of win rate here. That's turned out to be Sion, but this is exactly how this matchup should go if played correctly. The Rumble should have all the tempo in the world. The only player, like I said, who's playing a little bit behind right now is Jojo Pune, and the Anivia already was a pick that I think outside of lane was going to have a little bit of trouble initiating itself in this game. So for KOI, I think there are some things to fix. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like them losing to Los Ratones was a good thing, but the fact that they are bouncing back well and hopefully they can end out the week well is a good sign. And then for SK on the other side, Skeens is the obvious choice, I think, for dud of the game. Didn't really have to think about this too much. When you play Pantheon and you've got something like Rise, like this is one of the mid laners that I do like with Pantheon because you can be proactive and make plays. You can shove and roam and move around with the Rise, and that really helps the Pantheon be able to enable what is a very aggressive bot lane or a top side that can potentially really start to snowball pretty heavily. And if the Rise gets kills, then it becomes even easier for the Pantheon to play the game. This is a draft that I think is much more playable for SK if Skeens actually plays well. And the problem is he just did not in this game. He got completely out jungled by, of course, the Vi and Elyoya on the other side. And Skeens is just making a ton of mistakes right now. This guy is, again, regressed, I would say, into what we thought he was going to be coming out of the TCL last year. I was really critical of SK signing him towards the end of summer, and I was especially critical of them bringing him in alongside Abadaga. He obviously was the only player on that SK team in the summer split that was even kind of performing well. Kadui, I think, had some sort of argument, but Skeens was the player they kept around for a reason, and the one they, I guess, kind of built around outside of the Mickey X leader, like, Wunder trio here. And unfortunately, it's just not working out. Like, he's not able to carry that form over. It feels like he has, like I said, regressed into the bad version of him that there was for a majority of 2025, and I certainly cannot say I'm surprised when he goes up against competition levels that are more consistent right now instead of the group stage that he kind of had to deal with over the course of last split. I do think it makes sense that Skeens is perhaps struggling a bit more. I think Wunder had one of his weaker games of the split against Sion's been very strong, and Mirwin was just kind of better in this one. Leader is just not very good. He got counterpicked in the mid lane, and yet he still couldn't really do anything when JoJo was performing poorly. Mickey X played the Elise and completely ran it down. He is like fully completing his Lehens metamorphosis that he's been undergoing over the past couple of weeks. It's just pretty funny to talk about SK Gaming. There's really not a lot of depth to take away from this team. They have one win condition, which is Mickey getting out on the map, and then hopefully getting one of Wunder or Yoppa like super fed. Outside of that, like, there's just no way for this team to be able to win games because Leader and Skeens are one of the weakest jungle mid duos in the entire league. And then for Movistar KOI, it's nice to see them back on track, but like I said, they kind of need to finish this week strong, just like they started the split strong, because losing to Los Ratones is already a big negative in the minus column, and so you want to make sure that you counterbalance that with more than just a win over an SK team that you definitely should already be beating. Then moving on to our fifth game of day number 2, and this is a pretty important clash, I think, for both of these teams. It was K-Corp taking on Fnatic, and K-Corp is going to pick up the very clean victory. This was almost a perfect game for KC. The way that they ended up playing it out was just so clean, so consistent. I like this draft a lot more if you're going to go on the more passive side. I'm not necessarily a big fan of passive gameplay right now, especially if you're giving over things like Jace on the other side, but if you are going to go the slower route and you want to play something that's going to be a bit I guess beefier to kind of break through, and you might not have as much damage, but you might play these fights a bit slower, then I do think that things like Dr. Mundo, things like Gnar and Alistair start to rise in priority. Even something like Jhin can be really valuable because of the early priority it can generate without a ton of resources. The fact that it can play weak side is just a bonus, and of course Orianna kind of fits into that well. Overall, I think you have a much more balanced comp here if you want to go slow than what we're seeing out of a lot of other teams right now in the LEC, where they're drafting, you know, Vi or Pantheon in the jungle and then a really slow comp around it, which I think just kind of takes away the effect of both of what you're trying to look to do there. For Fnatic, I think most of their problems just came down to them not being good enough in this game. Quite frankly, they weren't better than K-Corp in terms of their execution. They needed to speed the pace of the game up with the Jace and the Varus in order to make this worthwhile. And then, of course, the moment that Varus has to stare down Mundo, Gnar, Alistair, and, you know, doesn't really have a lot of options to play the game throughout the rest of the back end here, then things are going to get a lot more difficult. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is obviously Busio. Didn't have to think about this at all. Busio was an absolute menace on the Alistair in this particular game. And I think the thing that is the most exciting is that when I think of Busio, I haven't really thought about tank engagers. Like, that's not necessarily the thing that he does at a super high level. Like, the Alistair has obviously always been really good. He can play things like Rel and Leona and Nautilus. Like, I'm not trying to sit here and say that he's not a very good support on those champions, but the big reason he broke out last year is because it finally became a meta where playmakers and these big, like, I guess, fight initiators that aren't tanks, like, became much more common. Obviously, things like the Bard and the Nico and the Rakan that have kind of been staples of his champion pool for a very long time. I call them the playmaking class. I think there are 3 classes of supports in pro play. Playmakers, tank engagers, and enchanters. And Busio, to me, has always kind of leaned on the playmaker side, but he's really exclusively played the tank engagers so far this year, and it is still working out. He's had very few bad games, and for the most part, he's been the best support in the entire league in terms of his actual production, which I guess is to be expected from the way he performed last year. Glad to see that Busio is living up to the hype, and quite frankly, I'm glad to see that Yehu is also living up to the hype in the mid lane. This was a pretty exciting matchup because it's Vladi versus the team that replaced him this offseason in K-Corp, and as it turns out, Yehu and K-Corp are the winners in that exchange, at least for now. Vladi has had a really hard time adjusting and getting that form back on Fnatic, and Yehu has done the opposite. I think he's played better than I anticipated him to basically from day number 1. I thought he would be very good by the end of the year, but I thought it would take him at least a split or a split and a half to really start to ramp up and get comfortable playing in the LEC, as it typically does for imports that weren't exactly superstars in the LCK, like coming over. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time for them to get used to playing at this level or playing in this country, or the communication styles, all of that stuff. Yehu has basically been as expected from day number one, which I think is really exciting for K-Corp fans. Kana was really good here, and Pyros really struggled on the top side. Yike was much better than Razork in this game, and then Kalist obviously just capitalized well on the Jhin. This was just a good game overall, but honestly, it's the new additions right now to K-Corp that are kind of carrying the team. It's Yehu and Busio that I think have been the two best players. And then for Fnatic on the other side, this was just a bad game. I mean, when you almost get perfect gamed, a lot goes wrong. Like, obviously, people are complaining that Upset was playing Varus this game, and Varus is obviously never going to do any damage, and why are you not playing AP Varus? Why are you not sending Varus top lane? There are a myriad of reasons why you can't really do a lot of that in this game. I do obviously think that the way Upset played Varus was incorrect in this game, but it's not going to change too much when you have so much backline access coming in from K-Corp. These front-to-backs are almost never going to work. You need this Jace in order to generate a gold lead in this game, and the moment that you give over early priority to K-Corp, this game is over. It does not matter what the Varus is doing. It doesn't even matter if this guy has gold or resources. If you don't have tempo on the map for you to be able to set up an areas first, then you don't really have a way to play this game, because you have to poke in the late game with Jace jungle, and you can't do that if he's behind in gold. So Razork for me is dud of the game. It just completely eliminates any chance for this team to be able to pilot the comp that they ended up drafting for themselves. This is one of the worst games I've seen Razork play in quite a while. He's been okay, I would say, at the start of this year. There have been times where he's looked very good. There have been times where he's looked not so good. This is easily the worst game he's had in 2026 up until this point, and this was a pretty big moment for him to step up in. He got the strongest pick of the patch, in my opinion, in the Jace, something that is basically permabanned against every other team. I don't know, man. It does not seem like LEC junglers are capable of piloting Jace in the same way that LCK and LPL junglers are capable of doing. That pick is not allowed in those other regions. It is very allowed in these regions, with just the way it's not been particularly effective. Vladi continues to underperform in the mid lane. I'm really starting to get disappointed with his output in lane, like in the 1v1s. He's just not doing well in that phase of the game. Pyros is just behind his competition. He does not play Varus, and not that he should be playing Varus in this game. Don't listen to Reddit. I promise, do not listen to Reddit that Varus would crush this game or anything like that. Jace is the centralizing force of this comp, and Pyros doesn't need to play it, but he also isn't doing particularly well for himself on the top side either. This is one of the few games where I feel like Upset and Lospa were just in no man's land. Like, Fnatic just can't really do anything if this bot lane is not in a good spot, and if Razork is running it, they are not going to win games. He's already a pretty volatile player. He's going to have a couple of bad games, and that's going to mean a couple of easy losses for this team. But for K-Corp, really nice win. Their new additions are doing incredibly well right now. If the rest of the team can come around on that consistency with players like Yike and Kana needing to start getting back to their 2025 form, if all of that comes together, there was a reason I put them back at number 1 in the power rankings at the end of last week. And with so much turmoil and confusion, quite frankly, at the top of the LEC standings, I still think it's pretty reasonable to consider K-Corp kind of the biggest threats right now in the entire region. But that's going to bring us to our final game of day number 2. And we want to keep the upset train rolling, and boy, do the storylines just make themselves. At this point, it was Los Ratones taking on G2 Esports, and Los Ratones are going to take down G2. Yes, you are hearing that right. A tier 2 team has beaten G2 in the LEC, and all we can do at this point is laugh. All we can do at this point is just crack a smile with how things are breaking down. LR is on a 4-game win streak right now in the LEC. They have completely rebounded. This team has gone from 0-4 to 4-4 in terms of their record, and G2 is sitting right there alongside them. These two teams are not only parallel, but Los Ratones might have just put themselves ahead of them in terms of expectations with this victory. Of course, obviously, I'm not going to overreact too much to a best of 1 and say that they are a better team. That is a ridiculous sentiment to have, but the fact that we are here at all is just utterly ridiculous. The fact that not only are LR beating G2 in a best of 1, which in isolation is not like the craziest thing you've ever heard with how the LEC works, but the fact that they are the same record now and that G2 is in genuine danger of being a team that has to fight their way into the playoffs is just absurd going into the final 3 games of the regular season. So I guess we can talk about how we got there. Crownie for me is going to be player of the game. I don't know how popular of a choice this is going to be, but I think he played great on the Unara in this one. And honestly, he's coming off of another game on day number 1 against equally good competition, or maybe better competition, in Movistar KOI, where he also was able to really control the laning phase and then play really well in the team fights. This guy has been super stable basically since this team has gotten back on a roll. I think Reckless is a big part of that. This team is spamming Nami down in the support position, and it's very much working out for them. But the fact that Crownie is good enough to be able to take those resources and turn it into massive teamfight wins on these hyper carries, that's what a lot of teams above them in the standings have been doing to get their wins at the beginning of this year anyways. And Crownie has always been a player that I think has the mechanics, as long as he's not making the mental errors, to really make a difference at this level. We've seen it before when he's played for teams like BDS, and obviously there's a bit of a warpath going on right now for Crownie. He just took down Labrov, his former bot lane partner, we'll just say, when he went to the World Championships a couple of years ago on that BDS team. But it's really cool to see him step up and play so well across both of the first 2 games of this week. I think you could argue there were other players that were more important, but I'm not going to argue that. I think Crownie was the most important player on the Rift. I think Reckless was pretty close on the Nami. I think he was a big reason why this Yunara was able to generate leads. When you're going into something like a Felios Lulu on the other side, you need your Enchanter to be a little bit more active on the map, because you are going to get outscaled. Even if you have that hyper carry down on the bot side, you need to be able to generate more resources than the Aphelios can on that side, and that's exactly what Reckless and Crownie were capable of doing. Velia is just spamming Mundo now, which I think makes a lot of sense. This guy has really struggled at not making positioning and mental errors in games, and he's still making them, but Mundo kind of bails you out of every single mental error you could possibly make. There's no bad invade with a Dr. Mundo, because you just can survive anything. Like, as long as your team is there to collapse, you can basically make any play work, despite how bad any play might be. Mundo is that get out of jail free card. It very much is easy mode at lower levels of like pro competition. I'm not recommending it for LPL or LCK teams where that kind of pick gets punished a lot more, but in the LEC, absolutely spam Dr. Mundo. I've been talking about it for a while. I continue to really dislike the Anivia into Ryze counter pick, just generally because it's very insular and it doesn't really do anything outside of the laning phase. But Nemesis was really good in this game. He was really effective on the Anivia just in general. It just so happened that it was the counter pick. Caps was still very relevant and certainly the most relevant player for G2 throughout this game, but everybody's going to be talking about it. Baus picked up a win on Kled, a champion that he's pretty, famously not very good at. Had a really funny clip coming out of, I believe, week 1 or week 2, one of the earlier weeks of the season, where, he's kind of being criticized for, like, why are you picking Kled? Like, why are you not just spamming the champions you're good at? And he's like, oh, it's pro play. Like, I have to pick for the comp. I have to pick for the team. But maybe if my Kled is this bad, then maybe it's not worth it after all. Turns out you can win on Kled in the LEC as long as you are Baus. I still think this champion is completely boosted, but Baus looked good and the ult looked good at the end of the game. So credit to the Los Ratones, man. This team could have very easily lost their mental and just like not won a single game like a lot of other teams that have been overhyped have in the LEC, but they regained it after their win in the middle of week 2, and they have not looked back since. They are 4 wins in a row to get themselves to 500. And for G2 on the other side, like, it is disaster mode. Like, there's nothing else left to say. Like, this team is not good. Like, they have a ton of real, genuine issues. This is not an isolated incident for this G2 team. You have Hansama and Labrov, who are like legitimately playing like a bottom 3 or bottom 4 bot lane duo in the league right now. Again, I took a victory lap earlier for, pumping the brakes on them, but I might have even been too high on the way that they are performing, because they genuinely look terrible in lane. Like, Hans is just not connected. This guy is not even attempting to play the game. He does not look like an upper half AD carry right now in terms of how things are going, and Labrov is not also connected to not only Hansama, but to Skewmond. Like, these two are not playing off of each other at all. It feels like there's almost no communication between support and jungle, which I think is one of the most important ways to link up in the entire game right now. Labrov, for me, is going to get dud of the game. I think he was even worse than Hansama was, although I think you could argue that Hans was, theoretically worse in terms of the outcome he had on the game. He just has a much harder job. Labrov is not doing anything on this Lulu. Their 2v2 lane is terrible. They're losing to players they have no business losing to in the 2v2, and it's not good, man. There's nothing else really to say. These two look quite washed at the moment in terms of the way that they are playing this out, and that is super predictable from how they played for a majority of last year. When Skewmond is not carrying, this team really has no shot. Like, Skewmond was out jungled for the most part. I'm not going to say he was out jungled. That feels pretty heavy in favor of Velia, who I think was mostly just a part of the game plan for Los Ratones, but Skewmond was not relevant on this Aatrox that other players have had success on. Broken Blade was generating resources, but he needed to generate a lot more into the Kled matchup, and Caps was trying to win this game on Ryze, but there's only so much you can do. G2 is genuinely not a very good team right now. This is not just a team that's kind of struggling. I don't think they're particularly competitive at the top of the standings, and that's with the top of the standings looking as bad as they have over the course of the beginning of this year, with Corp and KOI also losing a lot of games, with Fnatic going 0-2 at the start of this week. I still think that G2 is going to struggle to be able to try and win an LEC title with the way that they look right now. They have to fix so many different things, and it's just going to take some time to do so. I do not think they're going to be as competitive as people want, at least in split number 1. But for Los Ratones, they have completely fought their way way back into the playoff picture. This looked like a team that was dead in the water after 4 games. Not only have they rehabilitated their own image, they are now like genuinely the hottest team in the entire league going into the final 3 games, which is just a crazy thing to say. Everybody is starting to play better, and this team has not only found their identity, but utilized it to capitalize on some of the best teams in the entire league. But that's going to bring us to our third and final day of action here in the LEC in week number 3. And we kicked off day number 3 with a matchup between Corp Blue and Fnatic, where Fnatic is going to pick up their first victory of the week. They will end the week 1 and 2 in general, and they will get themselves a little bit back on track in terms of their overall record by the end of this. It kind of felt pretty bad for Fnatic for a bit, and I'm certainly not going to say that a win over the worst team in the league is completely righting the ship or anything like that, but it is nice to see that they can dominate when they are supposed to, even if they haven't necessarily lived up to the expectations they had for themselves, and even I had for them going in to this week. For KCB on the other side, obviously, this team is not very good, but this might be one of the weaker performances that we've seen out of them in quite a long time. This draft, people are complaining about. It's very similar to one that Gen G had over the course of last week when they played against Hanwha Life, and obviously, people are kind of memeing that, oh, it works for Gen G, doesn't exactly work for a KCB team that might not have the talent level to pull it off. I think this draft is totally fine in, essence of what it is. I think Pantheon Galio gets a bit of a bad rap because they don't do a ton of damage in the late game, but that's because you kind of need to supplement it with a hyper carry on the bot side. I think the real rough thing is that Hazel kind of has to build AD Kai'Sa in this game in order to do enough damage to kind of justify that mid-jungle pick, and you know what? Hazel's never going to get a chance to auto-attack throughout the rest of this game, so it's a bit of a tough sell overall. But KCB just not really finding their footing. This is one of the few games where it really just felt like they were outclassed even from moment 1. They still were able to get their standard, small leads in the early game because they have Pantheon, and Yukino's a good early game player, but generally just not enough to be able to maintain. For Fnatic on the other side, player of the game is kind of up for debate. I think that there are multiple good options here. I settled on Lospa in the support position. I know I'm a bit higher on this bot lane than basically everybody else is right now, it would seem. Maybe not everybody. I'm sure that there are some people out there that are really in on this bot lane, but I think even with Fnatic's struggles and all of the things that they're kind of doing wrong right now, the fact that the solo lanes aren't performing well, that Razork has been super inconsistent because he doesn't have consistent push out of the mid lane, all of that is happening. Upset and Lospa are very for real. Lospa has been one of the best rookies in the entire league in terms of adjusting and making good plays, and I think he's generally just been a positive for Fnatic. I'm not going to say he's been a top tier support day number 1, but I do think he's been a very good support day number 1 for this team. I would say somewhere in the top 6 or so, like a top half kind of guy, which you can't really say about most other rookies in the league right now. Again, outside of maybe Relich, he's the only one that I think is even in that conversation. Him and Upset, I think, have had good chemistry at the beginning of this year. They play off each other well, and when they get leads, they are very, very difficult to deal with. This might be one of the most potent bot lanes, I should say, in the entire league throughout the rest of the year, which is exciting. Do want to give some credit where credit is due. Vladi had a very nice game here against KCB. Needed to see this. He's been up and down, like I said. It's been mostly down over the course of this week, but I think in previous weeks he's been a lot better than maybe he's getting credit for. I think that there have definitely been some games that have been not so good from him, but a lot of the games have also been good. You just need to start getting those good performances a little bit more often. It's the volatility that I don't really like out of Vladi because, again, that wasn't really something that he had on Corp. He was very stable and very steady up until the summer split when it seemed like the mental was just imploding. And I kind of hoped that him going to a different org, him getting into a different spot, and just kind of getting away from that fan base that he clearly did not jive with was going to fix that mental. Not entirely sure that that's going to be doable. He might just be somebody who has a little bit of a more inconsistent track record because of all of the things mentioned before, but the good games are still there, and the Orianna was excellent here. He got the broadcast player of the game, but also you couldn't vote for Lospa, so, I don't really know how that ends up going if he is an actual option. Impiros had one of his best games so far in the LEC. Tao will do that. He's not particularly good. And then Razork, of course, was fine enough on the Poppy, one of his better picks in the jungle. It's a nice win for Fnatic that they needed to pick up. And then for KCB, really, it's just the same story, except it's a little bit sadder this time around. This is a team that's okay at being able to generate early leads because their individual skill levels are not all that bad in comparison to LEC talent, but there is no macro on this team. They have no decision makers, and they're very scared with how they want to use their resources in the later parts of games. So any gold lead that they have kind of needs to be like 2,000 gold needs to be subtracted from any gold lead they have because they're not going to play up to whatever gold lead they're able to generate. And of course, this is a pretty difficult to execute comp. You need your Kai'Sa to buy or to have a lot of time bought for her in these fights in order to win it. That's what the 4 tanks plus hyper carry is kind of for. I think this is a good draft, but only for better teams. And KCB is not really the team that's going to be able to pull that off. Prime had a pretty bad game. He had a pretty bad week, all things considered. I mean, KCB in general wasn't particularly good. Their best game was on day number 1, and they've, slowly got less competitive over the course of the week. But Prime, I think in general, definitely had his worst week so far in the LEC. It just feels like everybody is a bit, behind. Lostbow was making play after play on the map, and Prime was like 7 levels down throughout the end game. It was just something absolutely ridiculous. Obviously, it can be kind of hard to play a tank engager when you're down so much, but such is life. Yukino had a very weak game. Tao got completely destroyed on the top side. He has looked worse and worse, I think, in most games. Kamalu wasn't particularly doing much on the Galio, and again, Hazel couldn't even really play the game or auto attack at all on AD Kai'Sa as we got into the end game. KCB just had a really hard time keeping up, and this is more the result that I think we expected from a lot of the tier 2 teams, but credit to Fnatic for actually punishing them for a lot of their mistakes and actually capitalizing on the things that they did well in this game. Not every team has been able to say that, and even Fnatic has not really been able to say that across the rest of this week up until this point. So nice win to end their week off, even if week 3 in general was a pretty down one overall for Fnatic. Then moving on to our second game of day number 3, and another big one in the middle of the standings, SK Gaming taking on GIANTX. With GIANTX picking up a big win here, they got kind of their momentum stalled, I'll say, on day number 2 with that loss to Vitality, but they get a lot of it back here with the win over SK. Not that SK is the biggest piece of competition in the world right now, but GX was really kind of struggling to, I think, push their advantages. I think their bot lane hasn't looked quite as dynamic as they did in week number 1. Not that they've looked bad, they're still one of the best bot lanes in the entire league, and I don't want to take anything away. I just wanted to make sure that the top side of this map was good enough, because one of the big reasons I was concerned about GIANTX going into this year is I really just was not a fan of their top side of the map as much as I loved their bot lane, and it's good to see that at the very least against a lot of these other mid-table teams, they're still good enough to be able to kind of gap and take advantage of them. But for SK, I mean, this team is just not good. Wunder is really good, and Yopa at times can be good down in the AD carry role. The other 3, Skeens, Leader, Mickey X, they're just not playing well right now, and it's really costing SK Gaming. So let's go ahead and get into it, I guess, decently quickly. There's not really a ton to analyze here. GX goes down in the early game, but ends up, basically forcing their way back into this game with a couple of really big plays. It's kind of up to you to determine who player of the game is. Broadcast voted Jun, and I kind of agree here. He's going to get my player of the game on the Rakan. I think he was the one making the most amount of plays and certainly creating the most amount of action. I know people might not really like hearing me say this. I kind of consider Jackie's because I think he was pretty big in the late game team fights. Even if his early game wasn't particularly good, he went down very heavy to the Yone in lane, but honestly, you're kind of supposed to do that on the Azir. That's kind of how that lane matchup goes, and then you eventually try to fight your way back, and he had some really clutch plays and some big damage at the end of that game. He was surviving pretty late in these team fights, so I'm not really going to be super mad at him. I think he's had worse games for sure. Noah continues to be incredibly solid on the Corki. He gives his life towards the end of that game in order for them to basically win it all. Isma had a couple of big moments on the Jarvan. Lot was pretty good on the Rumble. Really, it was a team effort. Whoever you wanted to give that player of the game to was kind of up to you. The reason I ended up going with June is because I really think that a lot of their engages are much more difficult if he is not as comfortable pulling the trigger as he was in this game. I think he was very confident in the way that he engaged a lot of these team fights, and that ended up being a big difference maker, I would say, overall for GIANTX. So kind of a team effort, good come from behind win, and overall more of a solidifying win than anything for a GX team that we already, kind of felt pretty good about. And then for SK on the other side, it's just bad. Like, this team is just not very good. Skeens is going to get yet another dud of the game. Skeens has fallen off for me, and you can look at the KDA, you can look at the 5-2-2 scoreline, and you can say that, oh, he was actually pretty good in this game. He was actually, really setting things up. That scoreline is so fictitious. Like, almost every single team fight towards the end of this game on the Vi, he was actively inting away his own team's chances of winning this. You have a Taric on the support position down on the bottom side, and you are scared to go in, or you're mistiming it as the Vi, and you're going in and dying without doing any damage. It just felt so useless, and this is a prime Wunder type of game on the top side. This is a Ryze top lane that actively did incredibly well into the Rumble. One of the few actual meta counters that I think can start to really pressure out Rumble in terms of the lane damage, especially after you hit level 6 and you can start roaming around the map. Your ability to fight in these skirmishes is much higher, and that pairs well with things like Vi and Yone in that jungle mid duo. But It didn't matter, no matter how good Wunder was. And by the way, he wasn't particularly good in the laning phase. I want to point that out as well. It was one of the few lanes that actively wasn't particularly good. He was doing infinite damage in these late game team fights and really popping off. It just was never going to matter. His Vi had all the gold, and Skeens was absolutely running it down. I believe he actively lost SK this game, and I think he really has regressed towards the negative things that we saw out of him that we really didn't want to see come to the LEC from the TCL last year. Leader is just nothing. He does really well for himself in the laning phase and is able to set himself up into a good spot to really generate massive leads like he did in this game, and then he just does nothing throughout the rest of the game. It's so frustrating. This was so super consistent with him in Astralis as well when he first kind of came into the LEC and had a shot at tier 1. He was a good laner and couldn't do anything else, unfortunately. It seems he's never grown out of that, and his champion pool hasn't really grown either. He is literally the exact same player he was multiple years ago on Astralis, which is just so frustrating. Again, Mickey X tried his best on the Taric. He had some nice ultimates, some good timings. That champion is very strong and underutilized, but wasn't enough. Yopa was also not particularly fed in this game. And their bot lane is weaker than GX's, which is always going to make things difficult for an SK team that kind of relies on Yopa to be a big piece for them in the late game. So SK just don't look particularly good. They're a bottom 2 LEC team, like actual LEC team. I don't really know where they end up landing in the power rankings right now. Do I think they'll make playoffs? Probably not. I think their back is up against the wall, as it almost always is for the SK organization, but you can technically never count anyone out. And then for GIANTX on the other side, this is fantastic. This team is fighting it out for like a top 1 or 2 seed going into playoffs, which is just kind of a ridiculous thing to say for a GIANTX team that nobody expected to be in that zone, but it's all legit right now. Their bot lane is certainly one of the best in the entire league. Isma's playing well. If Lot and Jackie's can really start to lock in, specifically Jackie's, if he can start to play better, again, GIANTX is going to be a team that you actually have to be concerned about in the playoffs. Then moving on to game number 3 here of day number 3, the end of the first half of the final day, and we closed it off with Na'Vi taking on Los Ratones. And Na'Vi is finally going to put an end to the win streak here for LR. They cannot quite end week number 3 undefeated. They come pretty darn close, though. 2-1 in back-to-back weeks is certainly not something to be upset by. They are 1 game below 500 now in terms of overall record, but I don't think they're going to complain all that much considering that they started 0-4 and are now sitting at 4-5. So definitely could have been worse, but for Na'Vi, they continue their great run of form. As of right now, this, again, is a team that's competing to be in that upper echelon with GIANTX, with Vitality, who's had a great week overall. Teams like Fnatic and G2 and KOI, who are all struggling right now, are within that grasp as well. There are a lot of teams that are fighting it out to be kind of in that upper echelon in the LEC. Even Corp, I think, could be considered a part of that, although, you know, somehow I think that they are a little bit more, I guess, locked in than maybe some of those other teams. Maybe you even put Los Ratones in that conversation, but Na'Vi continuing to show that they are better than a lot of the other teams in that area, and it's mostly through their mid-jungle duo. Poby, for me, is going to get player of the game in this one, although Relich obviously has a pretty good case to be made as well on the Xin Zhao. I think their draft is just so much better. This Los Ratones draft is one of the ones that makes me the most upset, and the reason it makes me the most upset is because, like, it's all obviously not very good, and I'm going to get into why I don't like it generally, because I think that on a baseline level, I want to make it clear that I don't like the draft even in isolation, but then for the coaching staff to come out afterwards and be like, yeah, we just, you know, we kind of got outdrafted. We didn't really expect what we saw on the other side. You didn't expect Rumble, Rise, Bard? Like what are we prepping for if we're not prepping for those 3 champions? They're like the 3 most common champions in the entire game. I don't really understand what the idea was behind that, if that obviously wasn't the direction that they were going in. Either way, you guys know my thoughts. Pantheon plus Aurelion Sol, I'm out. And Pantheon with Caitlyn Karma and then Aurelion Sol in the mid lane, I'm super out. Like, I do not believe in this draft under any circumstance. You have to get this A-Sol so fed in order to make this comp work, because you're going to hit the late game both with 0 damage and 0 frontline. And that's just a really bad place to be, generally speaking, for a draft, because you're going to be entirely reliant on A-Sol stacks to be able to blow up everybody else, but you don't have the frontline unless Cassante is fed to make it work. You have a bad Cassante player on the top side. Your bot lane is going to be winning, quote unquote, but what's Caitlyn Karma going to be able to do to translate that lead? And who does Pantheon ult? At any point, if Pantheon shows up and ults you, you just kill him in this comp, because there's nobody that can peel away from him. You don't have the damage to burst anyone down unless Caitlyn is Omega fed. This is a really hard game to play for Los Ratones, and it just did not end up working out. Again, Na'Vi ends up making it work with Poby on the Rise. Rise has looked fantastic in the LEC. It's looked fantastic globally at the start of this year. It still does everything that you could want. It's pretty decent, I think is the word I'm looking for, in the laning phase. It obviously is great for roams, because at level 6 you get the roam Realm Warp, and once you start hitting that 1 to 2 item completion, and the moment you finish stacking your Roa, he is a tank. Like, he can just kind of be wherever he wants. He's one of the best split pushers in the game. He can team fight at a really high level. He's got good damage. He's just very versatile as a champion. You can plug and play him in basically any comp in the entire game, and it's going to work out. This is kind of the thing that Taliyah was really good at for a very long time, except Ryze is much more aggressive than Taliyah in the way that he can play the game because he does significantly more damage. So obviously, you know, Poby pilots him well. Ryze is very valuable, and Poby looks great. Relich continues to be fantastic. Velia was a nightmare on the other side of this matchup. We will talk about that. Velia off of Dr. Mundo is not an LEC caliber jungler, and I think, unfortunately, the book is kind of out on that. I imagine that champion will be permabanned against Los Ratones basically for the rest of time, at the very least in the LEC. I do not think he is going to get that champion again. Relich and Poby are one of the best jungle mid duos in the entire league, and it continues to look pretty good. One combined death across the bot lane here as well for Sam D and Paris. Paris in particular having a lot of success on the Bard, being able to move around in this game. He's looked very good on playmakers, which is very encouraging, something he was pretty good at in 2024 and kind of fell off of in 2025. Maintor was also much better than Baus on the other side of this, but Baus looked miserable on the Cassante, something I basically never want to see him on ever again. So nice win for Na'Vi, pretty bad loss for Los Ratones. This is week 1 LR, all the way back again, where they just don't look particularly competitive in their games in general. Again, their draft is really hard to execute on, but you can't blame the draft for everything. I certainly don't blame it for the way Baus and Velia played in this game, because they were awful. Velia, I need to say this, like, he is the worst player in the league. Like, I'm sorry to all the LR fans that probably don't want to hear that, or to the Velia fans that think he's, you know, a little bit better right now than maybe I do. This guy is worse than any player on KCB. He is worse than any other player right now in the LEC. He's been a bit protected because he's gotten to play things like Dr. Mundo, where he goes for these invades and he maybe even dies a couple of times per game, but for the most part, like, Mundo just kind of scales into the late game and can be relevant no matter what. In a lot of game states, you can't really get away with that on most other champions. You can't even really get away with that on Mundo in most other regions, but Velia on something like Pantheon that has to make an early game impact that can kind of be punished for a lot of positioning mistakes and a lot of over aggressive plays, I'll just call it out. Like, Velia is just not going to succeed on those champions. There's nothing else really left to say in that regard. I don't think he's a particularly good player right now. He is certainly not tier 1 caliber, and he will hold Los Ratones back. I have a feeling he is going to be a big problem for them and may cost them playoffs, depending on how things go throughout the rest of the regular season. Baus, of course, also has a decently limited champion pool if his jungler is running it down. Baus is the player that is the worst laner in the entire league, and you just have to hope he can survive until the late game. Can't really do that playing Cassante into Rumble. You're going to get absolutely torched, and Baus was terrible in this game. He was even terrible in the late game, not that we ever got there in this 30-minute game. Nemesis, Crowny, Reckless, I'm not blaming them entirely. I don't think they did anything individually bad. Nemesis picking Aurelion Sol in this instance is already bad enough, and then if you're going to play Caitlyn Karma, which is already a very weird lane to play in general because of just, you don't really want Caitlyn in this draft, you want Ezreal, like, that is how you want to play this draft. You've set everything up to play Ezreal, and then you just don't pick it. I guess he's a Caitlyn player. We know that Crowny plays a lot of this champion. It just felt kind of strange. Even if you do want to go that route, it certainly is not an Aurelion Sol angle. Los Ratones were just in a bad spot from minute number 1, and it was always going to be tough. They got completely outplayed and they got outdrafted. Just a great game for Na'Vi, who continues to be in a great spot. They understand the meta well, probably better than almost any other LEC team at the moment, probably better than any other LEC team, to be quite frank, at the moment, including the top tier teams. They have a great meta read. They seem to have a good understanding of where they want to be on the map. I'm really starting to believe in the coaching staff alongside these players, and I'm really starting to like this org. I think they look like a pretty good addition in their first full year here in the LEC. Then moving on now to game number 4 of day number 3, and a very, very fun one to watch. It was Team Vitality taking on G2 Esports, and G2 is just barely going to pick up the victory. This really felt like a clash of titans, not because both teams were good, but because 8 of the players on the Rift here were absolutely terrible, and 2 of them were trying their absolute best to carry their teams across the finish line. Of course, I'm talking about Caps and Knock in terms of the 2. It's the 2 players you would have expected in this particular instance. Maybe Skewmond would have been considered in there before this game. He was fine, generally speaking. I don't think anybody on G2 was overall horrible in that same kind of way, although Lebrav was not particularly great in this one. But really, this was Caps with all the gold in the world on the Azir, trying to carry G2 in a lot of these fights, and it was Knock saying, I don't care how much gold you have, I'm gonna solo kill you, like, once, for real, but almost twice in this game in side lanes and completely try and dominate in favor of Vitality and just the rest of his team not letting him win the game. It's actually ridiculous how well Knock is playing right now. He's playing like a top 2 top laner in the LEC, and unfortunately the rest of his team is not always on the same page as that. As we know, they can be pretty volatile, and this is unfortunately the bad end of the spectrum for Vitality. So Let's get into it. It's a pretty easy game, I guess, to have a conversation about. There's not really a ton to go over here in terms of how they were playing. Caps was excellent. He's going to get player of the game. You can criticize the fact that he got solo killed by Knock, that he probably should have been solo killed twice in this game by the Rumble, but at the end of the day, he had all the gold, he had all the resources, and he won the team fights for this team around major objectives, and if he's not playing as well as he is, they don't win this game. It really did feel like it was Caps or nothing, and isn't that so emblematic of G2 Esports over the past year and a half or so? It's either Caps or it's nothing, because the rest of this team is just giving you such inconsistent play, and it's really frustrating. Of course, Caps, I think, really started to come out of his shell again this week. I'm not going to say he was bad in the first couple of weeks. That feels pretty disingenuous towards Caps as a whole, but he wasn't Caps, right? He wasn't playing particularly well. I think he was actively, losing in lane a little bit more than you would expect, even if he is more of a late game team fight type of player at this point in his career, but overall, to see him bounce back and just have such a fantastic week number 3, even if G2 struggled to pick up wins, that is a really good sign. This, of course, was a win that G2 really needed to grab in terms of their standings, and they were capable of doing so. Some credit, I guess, should go to Skumond, who I think had some moments in this game where he was at the very least more stable than Linsauce, had a couple of key knockups in that final fight that really ended up mattering. Broken Blade, Hans, Lebrov, you know the story. Hans didn't make any mistakes. He was fine in this one, which I think is the best possible scenario for Hans at this point. Broken Blade was worse than Knock in a matchup that isn't particularly favorable. Once again, I'm just stunned that we keep opting into this Cassante into Rumble matchup when the Cassante almost never has the pressure that you would want. Lebrov was the only one that was actively dying regularly, and it's because he's really the only competent frontliner on G2 because Broken Blade had no gold from the laning phase. So for G2, it's a nice win. Caps continues to look great. If Skumond can get into the form he was in week 2 and kind of in week 1, and you have the Caps that's kind of emerging here in week 3, I think this team can be decently dangerous as a top 2 team in the league, especially with a team like KOI kind of struggling right now. But Hans, Lebrov, and Broken Blade are just not in good form, and they are inherently going to put a ceiling on what G2 can be in 2026. And then for Vitality on the other side, Linsauce for me is dud of the game, although I considered Humanoid for this as well in the mid lane. I'm giving it to Linsauce, if only because that final play he made in the final fight just made me so angry that I really just couldn't contain myself. I like Linsauce as a player, but when you have the Yone ult lined up onto Caps and it feels like it could be game ending if he ends up landing it because you can catch out all of the gold on G2 and all of a sudden this Rumble and this Corki can start to take over the fights, and then Linsauce Qs into Caps, knocking him out of the Yone ultimate, you just have to go like, GG's, it's not happening. It's not worth it right now. Like, it is just terrible to watch that happen live. Linsauce for me, like I said, is dead of the game. He was not particularly good this week. He'll have some bad games. He's not consistent. I think he is still better than a lot of people will give him credit for, but this was not a very good showcase of that. Humanoid was also quite bad. I think people are going to point to the fact that he almost hit a good Yone ult at some point in this game. He hit one really good Yone ult in the middle of this game, but outside of that, was bad in lane, really couldn't play side lanes. He left it entirely up to his top laner to try and win this for him, and Knock tried his best. This guy really is playing out of his mind right now. He's not only better than Broken Blade, I think you can make a strong argument that he's better than any other top laner not named Kana in the entire league right now. Like, he really is playing at that kind of level. And again, I didn't expect that. I didn't expect that to happen immediately in year number 2, but it absolutely is. All of that potential is becoming reality. And you know what? Kana's not exactly, lighting the world on fire. Knock right now is performing phenomenally for a top laner in the LEC, and he's on a fast track to be one of the best players in the entire region. Carzzy and Fleshy, I should say, were also pretty okay in this game. Not that they were super important, but overall, unfortunately, Vitality just didn't have the execution to play off of their Rumble in the late game and win this one. G2 are bailed out by the fact that they have the best LEC player of all time on their roster in Caps, and luckily for them, he was able to outduel Knock when it mattered the most in team fights. Azir is just a tiny bit stronger than Rumble when you get to the 5v5s, but G2 still look very, very beatable, very, human, if you will, in terms of their success chances. This is a team that I still believe is not going to find a ton of success until they kind of overhaul the way they play the game. If their early games are as bad as they've been over the past week and a half, or really the entire split, even going back to last year, this is not going to be a team that repeats as massive champions here in the LEC, but we've seen them make that progress before, as they did in the summer split last year. You just have to hope they can do it again in 2026. Then moving on to the 5th game of day number 3, and we keep the upset train rolling, man, in week number 3 here. It's Team Heretics taking on Movistar KOI, and somehow, some way, Team Heretics is going to pick up the win here. I'm telling you, man, this team figured out what they needed to do. They just needed to start drafting hyper carries and then a bunch of facilitative pieces around ice, and all of a sudden, things get a ton better for their win chances. For Movistar KOI, I guess what has to happen for them is they have to lose their minds. They have to completely lose their marbles in terms of the way that they're positioning. Myophelio Aphelios has to flash onto Orianna Q and kill himself. Like, I don't know what's going on here, man. Movistar KOI looked so good before week number 3, and it all fell apart. It all just disintegrated into the wind in week number 3. It's so frustrating that this is happening to every team in the LEC. The only solace that I can continue to have for this region is the fact that it's all best of ones, and that you can't freak out too much about a best of one where, you know, anything can happen. Your AD carry can just flash onto Orianna and just kill himself in the pivotal fight that probably wins your team the entire game, and then everything is over. That doesn't happen if it's a best of 3 or a best of 5. That's the copium that I think I'm going through right now with this region, because genuinely the gameplay is astounding me in terms of how it is turning out. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game kind of has to go to Saren. No, I mean, like, you can talk about the fact that Supa killed himself on the Orianna, but that Orianna still killed the Aphelios, and at the end of the day, the Ori was also absolutely tearing people apart throughout the rest of this game as well. The shockwave obviously was massive, but multiple shockwaves in this game were really game warping, especially onto Jojo Pume. That Azir really could have taken over. I know Jojo's not playing particularly well at the moment, but at the end of the day, it's still an Azir in the late game paired up with something like an Aphelios. There are plenty of ways to be able to play out this game with the Rumble if you get late enough, and Saren just being the most proactive player on the Rift, dealing the most damage, and obviously finding targets to use that damage on was the biggest priority and the biggest reason why Heretics was able to walk out with the win. He certainly played his 2 best games of the entire year in the last 2 games, and that is probably the best case scenario for Heretics. Maybe it took him some time to get comfortable playing in the LEC, all of this stuff, yada, yada, yada. It's best of ones. You can't really judge him too much, because this was a player that, again, I genuinely thought was going to come in and really upgrade this team from what they had in Camelot last year. Hadn't really felt like that was going to happen through the first couple of weeks. Again, the last 2 games are very small sample size, but they've looked much, much better for him and for the team as a whole playing around him, which is good. Bot lane continues to be the focus here. Ice is either going to get a pentakill or it's, you know, they're not going to get particularly far. Like, obviously, he doesn't get one in this game, which I think is a good reprieve for Team Heretics, because it kind of does prove that they can win without him just absolutely dominating. But put this guy on a hyper carry every game. No more Jhin, no more Caitlyn, no more, you know, anything else. No more Ezreal, no, like, none of these other champions that want to dominate lane. Kalista, I don't care about the 2v2 priority. I just want to see this guy play late game team fights. That's all he can really do at a high end level, but he's so good in that particular phase of the game. You see a lot of people talking about how, like, oh, shifters were so stupid to get rid of Ice to bring in Paddock. Well, Paddock should theoretically be a better player in comparison to Ice. The problem is, Ice is just so much more specific in the way that he's playing the game. Stend obviously helps. He's a very good facilitative type of support, and I think he's somebody that's settling in once again now that the rest of the team is starting to play well. He was playing well at the beginning of the split as well, just didn't have as many chances. Even Trayson I thought was okay in this game on the Cassante. Mostly good stuff here for Team Heretics. They've ended the week pretty strong. They've established their own identity, and for a team that looked like they were almost certainly going to be the weakest in the entire league throughout a lot of this year, they've kind of rebounded well. This is a big win, and one that really raises their stock, in my opinion, in terms of what they could be, because they drafted their style and beat a pretty good team. And then for Movistar KOI on the other side, Supa is obviously dead of the game. Like, even if he was relevant throughout a majority of the rest of this game on the Aphelios, the fact that he flashed in and killed himself in the most important fight in the game is just, like, completely unacceptable. There is no universe in which that play can be, you know, passed off as anything other than the game-losing play for his team. He doesn't make these super often. I think that is the saving grace here for Movistar KOI, is he's not the kind of player that throws away game-winning leads all the time. Like, you can argue that he's not a top-tier AD carry, like everybody in my comment section tends to argue every single week. Like, I understand that I'm a bit higher on this guy, but even when you want to be negative towards him, you can talk about him not generating resources at the same clip as other AD carries. You can't really talk about him just stepping up and killing himself in team fights. It's not really his MO. So, you know, I think this is an isolated incident. You just have to hope that it doesn't happen again, because it was pretty darn bad. Jojo is also just very off of his game this week. Again, this happens. As somebody who's covered Jojo's entire career on this channel, this will happen with Jojo Pume. Sometimes he will just be out of form for a week or two and then get back into form. We saw it multiple times last year for Movistar KOI, so I'm not freaking out. Mirwin wasn't particularly good. He is more of a product of the rest of the team. Elyoya was still pretty good, and I think Alvaro found some nice engage angles. They were just way too late on the Alistair. Don't get it wrong. Like, don't get it twisted at all. This is an unacceptable loss for Movistar KOI. Like, they cannot be coming out here and losing to Team Heretics. That's just not something that you can feasibly feel good about if you are Movistar KOI, but it's best of one, and this was a very weird game in general. You have to imagine that the rest of this team is going to get their form back moving forward, and I would be more concerned if there were teams that were, like, on their heels in terms of trying to compete for the upper echelon, but I'm serious. There just are not a lot of teams that are good in the LEC right now, or at the very least confirmed good in the LEC with these best of ones, so I don't want to panic. I don't want to freak out. It's just not not a good loss. And it's a big win for Heretics. They did get their own comp and they utilized it well, but really this kind of begs the question, okay, are Heretics actually a good team because they are now drafting around their strengths and playing towards the comp that they probably should have been playing towards all along? Or is this all facetious? Are teams going to ban out specific picks? And is this kind of a just crazy week where upsets happen and anybody can beat anybody and they're going to go back to being bad? We're going to have to see a little bit more as we go throughout the last week number 4 of the regular season, but I am more intrigued by Heretics walking out of week 3 than I was walking into it. But that's going to bring us to our 6th and a final game of day number 3. And our final game of the week here is we saw Shifters taking on Corp. And Corp are going to dominate their way to a win here on the final game of the week. Big stuff here from KC. Obviously, you wanted to see them come out and kind of prove that they still are the number 1 team. Yeah, I think they're running away with that title right now with teams like Movistar KOI randomly dropping games to teams they have no business losing games to. We'll talk about that in the power rankings a bit more in just a minute as we go throughout the rest of this video, but Corp should not be struggling with a team like Shifters as much as I like Nuke, and as much as I think on the right day, Trimby and Rooster can do something, even Paddock can probably do something. There are some massive talent gaps in between these players, even on their best days, and that's a big problem for Shifters. This team is kind of in free fall mode. I don't really know what to talk about when it comes to them. They're just kind of disappointing right now, like generally speaking. Like they don't really have specific things that they're entirely terrible at. I mean, they're not good in the early game, and they're really not good at playing from ahead, but you know, those are two things that only are the most important thing in the game, so what do I know? But let's go ahead and talk about Corp here. Player of the game is going to Yike for me. Crazy that I even have to debate this considering just how dominant Yike was in this game on the jungle Jace. Here's why Jace is banned in every region that isn't the LEC. Like, this is the game that kind of proves, oh yeah, this is what this champion can do in the right hands with an actual good team. He just completely breaks the game. Like, there is nothing that this champion can't do. He will one-shot every single person in the entire game. He will do so with ridiculous clearing efficiency. He can affect any lane really at any time because his mobility is incredibly high with the speed up to move around the map. There's literally nothing that this guy can't do at a ridiculously high level. You don't want to skirmish against a Jace team, especially not with something like a Galio in the mid game. Like, how do you fight at one item against this guy? You just don't. You like lose the game if you give him any sort of resources, if he's neutral at all. And that's what happened here. I mean, this must have been like an 8k gold lead at some point for Yike in the jungle, something ridiculous. I know that I believe it was Jat on Twitter who was like, is this the biggest gold lead of a jungler ever? No, you got to go back to a previous matchup between Wisdom and Maxlor many years ago that I'm sure LEC fans or EU LCS fans back in the day will remember quite fondly. But Yike here was pretty darn close. Certainly in terms of modern League of Legends, with the way that things have unfolded and the game has changed over the past couple of years, this is by far the biggest individual jungle lead I've ever seen. Like, this was pure domination from Yike. This is him getting back on track. I'm not going to say he's been perfect over the course of this split, but he's been pretty darn good, and this is like cementing himself as like, yeah, you know, you putting me as the #1 jungler at the beginning of the season, that might have not been all that far from the truth, because that is the kind of performance that he gave in this particular game. Busio just continues to be excellent, though. That's what I'm saying. The fact that it wasn't a runaway for me for player of the game with Yike is ridiculous. That's just how good Busio was in this particular matchup. This guy's gonna win MVP, or at the very least is gonna be in huge consideration for MVP. For all of the European fans who are like, oh, what's all the hype about this North American guy coming over? Why is everyone saying he's just going to be our best support day one? I hope you've learned what we've been talking about in North America over the past year. This guy should have won MVP in the LCS last year, sorry, the LTA North. Inspired got it because he was very good, and I think he was important to that FlyQuest team, but Busio to me was the best player in North America over the course of last year, and all he's done is come over here to Europe and arguably be the best player in the LEC as well. Like, he really is that dominant as a support. There is no Western support in the game right now that is as good as Busio. You could very realistically make a top 5 supports in the world video and include Busio on that list. And I don't think anyone would really feel all that outlandish by that. So credit to this guy. He just looks ridiculously good on this KC team. Yehu continues to look very comfortable. Kalist has been fine. And Kana hasn't even really been in overdrive mode yet. He's not the MVP that he was last year, and they're still dominating games. That's how good KC can be on their best day. If all 5 of these members are clicking, they should be the best team in the entire league. Anything less is still a big problem for this team. And then for Shifters, again, how do I even really, you know, analyze this team? Like, obviously they're worse than Corp. They're not supposed to to be nearly as good as K-Corp on paper. Bukata is the problem. Like, I hate to just single him out like so specifically, but they paid a ton of money for a guy that was a popular promotion. He played for K-Corp Blue and, you know, had some success there. He got promoted up to SK, and BDS shifters were basically like, I don't care that he hasn't really shown anything at the LEC level. He's an SK player that underperformed on that team. We've seen what happens when you take those players out of that organization. They can start performing a lot better. So let's get Bukata on the roster. Oops, it's not very good. This guy is not very good at League of Legends, and he does not look like he is going to be a productive jungler at the tier 1 level. They spent a lot of resources and money and investments on this guy, and he's just not very good. So that is a pretty big problem for the org. He's dead of the game here. He has gotten a lot of these. He is one of the worst players in the LEC, and that's not very good right now in a jungle position that is more important than it has ever been. When Nuke is getting run over, things are pretty problematic. This team cannot win without playing through the mid lane right now. Rooster was okay on the top side, but I'm not really super impressed. Paddock was fine enough on the Sivir, but Trimby was running it down by the end of the game. The gap in terms of proactivity and playmaking from these two supports was massive. Like, these two were facing off in the LTA last year to determine the #1 seed. Let's not forget how that series went with Busio kind of embarrassing Trimby. We're seeing that again here, this time in Europe, though. Just kind of ridiculous. Like, shifters are not a particularly good team. They're probably not top 7 at the current moment, probably around number 8 or 9 in terms of these rankings, but K-Corp are back on track. This is a team that should kind of be demolishing teams of this caliber. This was the expectation for them, that they perform very similar to what someone like FlyQuest did in North America last year, where they were just more talented than everybody else in the region. That is the kind of performance you are expecting out of a K-Corp team with this kind of talent, and despite some of their shortcomings that we've even seen this week, they are at times living up to that perception. And I think all that we can hope now as fans of this team and of this region is that they're able to keep it up. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC versus week number 3 overview and analysis video. Thank you guys again for sticking around. These videos are always incredibly long. I don't know if we're going to have to do a format change going into the spring split if everything stays the same, if we continue to have multiple videos per week that are like a bunch of slides. Like, obviously this feels awesome to do, and I'm glad that I get to go in depth on the LEC, but this is quite an undertaking in terms of making sure that all of these slides are correct and, going game by game and all of that stuff. Obviously, I'll let you know if there are any changes. There certainly won't be for the rest of this split, but that's besides the point. Up on your screen, the updated standings after 3 weeks of action here, and with only 2 games remaining, a lot of things are starting to become clearer and clearer. 3 teams have locked themselves into playoffs. K-Corp alone right now in first place at 7-2, and then GIANTX and Na'Vi both at 6-3 have confirmed their spots in the playoffs. Remember, playoffs is top 8 in the region, so 4 teams will not make it, 8 teams will. That means we also have 1 team that has been eliminated from playoff contention. That is just KCB down at the bottom of your standings. They are the only team that is actually eliminated right now, which is insane to say going into the final 2 games of the regular season, but here we are. You can see my personal power rankings to the right of every single team. You can also see how they have changed to the right of that under the change column. We can go over risers and fallers. Notably, I don't feel comfortable making a lot of changes right now. I received a lot of flack for this in the LCK when I did it a couple of weeks ago, just saying like, hey man, I don't really know where these teams are at right now, and so I don't feel comfortable saying that I'm too far off of my preconceived notions at the moment. In terms of groupings, I have a pretty good idea. K-Corp is the clear #1 team in the league, and then I think kind of opens up from there. If you want to say that teams like KOI, G2, Fnatic don't deserve to be in the top 4 right now, I kind of understand where you're coming from. I just believe that they are going to be top 4 moving forward. Fnatic, obviously, the most questionable of that, but this is really the first week where they've genuinely not looked very good, and I have to try and write off 2 games. Like, I'm not going to panic and freak out over that. If they continue to look bad across week number 4, then yeah, I'll start dropping them to number 5 or number 6 or even further in the power rankings if it continues to be a bit of a problem for them as it is right now. I just think that this team went through a couple of struggles, as most young teams tend to do, and I think they'll be fine. I specifically believe in their bot lane. For me, it's just hard to give up on KOI and G2 being in the top 3 as well, despite the fact that they're not playing particularly well. G2 in particular had a rough week despite their wins, and KOI obviously losing to Heretics and Los Ratones. It's not a good week for them either. I just feel like they're going to be able to rebound and figure it out with the kind of talent and track record, quite frankly, that these orgs have. I'm just giving them a bit of the benefit of the doubt. We'll see how that plays out. And then 5, 6, and 7, they all are the same grade. It's whatever level of confidence you personally have on those teams. GIANTX, Na'Vi, and Vitality, I think, are all within the same cluster right now. Vitality was obviously number 8, so they move up to number 7, but I didn't feel good about moving GIANTX or Na'Vi down, considering they're top 2 in terms of seeds right now. I understand that Vitality looked better than both of these teams this week for the most part. They even pushed G2 quite a bit on that final day, and they won a big series against GIANTX in this week as well, so maybe they should be number 5. If you wanted them at 5, be my guest. I have no problem with that. If you wanted GIANTX at 7, be my guest. Any configuration of these 3 teams in any order, it's really just your confidence ranking for now. I'm going to trust the GX bot lane. I think Navi's looked very good, and while I really like the way Vitality played this week, and I think they probably looked the best of any of these teams in week number 3 specifically, I don't really trust them in the same kind of way that I trust the other 2 teams because of their lack of consistency. But the rest of the power rankings are pretty dynamic. Jumping all the way up to number 8, it's Los Ratones. Somehow, someway, a tier 2 team is in the top 8 for me, and I do believe that they will make playoffs in the form that they are currently at. Do I think it will be easy? No. I haven't even really looked at the schedule. Maybe their schedule is just omega hard, and it's kind of cooked for them, and they're going to end 4-7, and it's going to have been a fun ride. I think that is very possible for this team, but for now, I think it's fair to say that they are better than the worst teams in the LEC, even if it's just from a confidence perspective. If they get taken off of their game, if Dr. Mundo gets banned in the final 2 games and they look like absolute garbage, then maybe you can start to say that they were playstyle merchants, but I need to see that to believe that. I need to see them proven to be frauds rather than just kind of believing, because at this point, they've kind of proven that they are at the very least competitive. Shifters fall all the way down to number 9. At this point, this team is just disappointing. Like, there's nothing else left to say. Nuka's still been pretty good, and I think there are pieces that can let them win games. They're not the worst team in the entire league, but they're certainly not in that same conversation with the upper tier that we thought they were going to be. At least the upper tier of, like, middle table teams, like 5, 6, or 7. They're nowhere near that right now in the rankings. Heretics is going to stay at number 10, and falling down 2 spots, and I guess kind of falling below Heretics here, is going to be SK Gaming, falling down to number 11. I've completely fallen out of love with this team. There is nothing to like about the way that they are playing the game right now, even though they beat Heretics this week. I think they look so much worse over the course of the final 2 days that I believe that that win probably wouldn't go the same way over the course of, you know, the next couple weeks if it continued. I think Heretics has figured out their playstyle, and SK, while they figured out a playstyle, is not one that they are going to win a lot of games with. KC Blue obviously is staying at number 12, the only team to not pick up a win this week. Very crazy stuff. Let me know if you agree or disagree with either the lack of changes or some of the changes that I did make down in the comments section below. Very curious to know you guys' thoughts and opinions down there. But let's go ahead and get into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 3. Player of the week, it's gonna go to Caps, the main character of the LEC, if you will, the main character of European League of Legends at this point in his career, is dragging G2 across the finish line. Last week, I said the same exact thing about Skewmond, and last week that was true, but even Skew had to take a bit of a break this week because he'd been carrying so much in the first couple of games, and it was Caps' time to step up. Hans, Labrov, Broken Blade, they've just not been very good throughout 2026 so far. And if that's going to continue to be the case, Caps is going to need to have some superhuman performances like this. He won 2 games on his ear, lost that game that he went deathless on the Rise. Still kind of feel crazy about that, but he was generally the most consistent player in a week where nobody went undefeated in the LEC. As for honorable mentions for player of the week, Busio, the support for K-Corp, if he was better on day number 1, he would have easily gotten player of the week because his day 2 and day 3 games were the 2 best games that I think almost anyone played throughout this entire week. It's just unfortunate he was really bad on the first day, and that kind of kept him out of contention, at least for me. And then Fleshy, the support for Vitality. I think Vitality had a ton of success in general over the course of this week, but to me, Fleshy was kind of the main piece. I think he wasn't as big of a problem in their loss to G2 at the end of the week, and he was a really, really big piece in their first 2 wins at the beginning of the week that were, you know, big over some important teams, kind of gapping Busio in that game. So Busio and Fleshy, 2 supports, my choice for honorable mentions this week. And then my dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to Skeens, the jungler for SK Gaming. SK have so many problems on the map right now, but don't let Skeens' KDA fool you. This guy is actively running down games and has really reverted to some of the worst tendencies that he had when he entered the league. Really frustrating to see that a lot of that development that I think surprised a lot of us at the end of 2025 is just not sustainable. This is a bad culture right now. It doesn't really seem like this SK organization has any idea what they're doing or that Mickey X's plan is coming together in any way, shape, or form, and unfortunately, I think it's taken itself out on Skeens, who misplayed in some major moments to really cost SK this week. There were other options, but I ended on Skeens being my dud of the week and Caps being my player of the week, but that's going to finally do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're covering week 4 of the LEC next week. As it comes out, we'll be covering the playoffs once those start happening here in the LEC for LEC Versus, and then First Stand when that tournament comes around. We cover 3 of the other major regions every single week on this channel as well: LCS, LCK, and of course LPL, which I am casting tonight. Pray for my voice, as I just did this 2-hour long podcast video video, but definitely go ahead and check out the other content. Subscribe if you are interested, and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all